What if everything you remember about your own life is nothing more than the reflection of something someone wanted you to see? What if your dearest memories, the ones you've kept so carefully, are shadows, deliberately planted to hide a truth too unbearable to face? And what if, deep down, every old photograph is a trap, an elegant frame for forgetting? There's something profoundly unsettling about the things that survive time. A yellowed portrait, a scent preserved in fabric, the echo of a laugh your mind insists on repeating even when the body that produced it has long turned to dust. These small ruins of the everyday form what we call memory. But what if memory isn't a mirror? What if it's a painting? And what if the artist lied? Some truths can't bear the light. They hide in attics, in forgotten shoeboxes, in family albums no one dares to open anymore. That's how it began, with a photograph. An old, almost colorless image, taken more than 50 years ago. It appeared by chance. But chance, I've learned, is destiny's favorite disguise. That photograph would change everything. Not only what I knew about others, but, most of all, what I believed about myself. Because sometimes the past isn't dead. It merely waits for the right moment to be found, and, once it is, it doesn't settle for being remembered. It demands to be relived. Time has a sound. It's not the ticking of clocks, nor the wind moving through trees. It's denser, almost imperceptible, vibrating just beneath the skin. It's the sound of something trying to return. I always believed love could save everything. But love, too, is a kind of blindness, and, when darkness is sweet, it becomes an easy place to hide. Maybe that's why when I found that photograph, I didn't feel fear, only a quiet curiosity, like seeing a forgotten face in a dream. Yet something was wrong with it. A detail the eye takes time to catch, but once seen can never be unseen. It was as if the eyes of the people in the picture knew something I didn't, as if they were looking back at me through time, bound by a silent, dreadful complicity. And what if they truly did know? They say every old house has its own sound, a kind of breathing made of echoes and memories. The mansion where this story unfolds was like that. Built on a fog-covered hill, it seemed to watch the small town below with almost human patience. Its hallways were long and winding, its grey and pale green walls holding the breath of entire generations. It was there that everything came together, love, loss, and the photograph. And it was there, too, that reality began to unravel, as if the house itself breathed through the memories of those who dared to live inside it. Sometimes I think I never entered that mansion. I think it entered me. And that's why telling this story is more than remembering, it's opening a wound. But some wounds must be opened, so that blood may flow again, even if what comes out is not life, but truth. What if the past isn't what has passed, but what still lives within us, disguised as memory? And what if love is merely the most beautiful form vengeance ever took against forgetting? Those questions have haunted me ever since I held that photograph. The paper was fragile, the surface almost damp, as if it had been taken not decades ago, but minutes. And on the back, a single line written in faded ink: "Please, don't believe everything you see." It was then I understood what I was about to uncover wouldn't just be a story about the past. It would be a story about what the past can do to us when we let it wake. And as night fell upon the house, the wind carried with it the first whisper in ancient voice, like the crackle of a photograph being unfolded. It wasn't a memory, it was a calling. And that's how it began. That morning had the kind of light that seemed to belong to no particular hour, neither day nor night, only the pause between two times. The air was cold and still, and the sky, veiled by pale clouds, cast the world in shades of grey. It was beneath that suspended light that he arrived at the old mansion, the photograph still in his hands, as though carrying a sentence. The house stood at the edge of the valley, surrounded by ancient trees bending in opposite directions, as if resisting an invisible wind. Its moss-covered walls seemed to exhale dampness and memory. Every stone on the facade bore a scar of time, but there was something else, something that wasn't just age, but watchfulness, a silent presence that came not from inside the house, but from the house itself. The man, or perhaps the traveler is the better word, for no one truly lives in such places, stood for long minutes before the rusted iron gate. The hinges cried out like a lament when he pushed it open, and for an instant, he felt as though he was crossing not just a physical boundary, but the threshold of another kind of existence. One where time didn't move in straight lines, but folded back upon itself. He was a historian, or something close to one. He had spent years studying old records, letters, forgotten fragments of other people's lives. But what had brought him here wasn't research, it was a feeling, an impulse born the moment he'd found that photograph in an antique market weeks before. The seller said it came from a private collection, its origin unknown. Yet something in the image had deeply unsettled him. It was as if, in the eyes of one of the figures, he had seen a trace of himself. He had tried to ignore it, to rationalize. But reason has fragile borders, and the past, when it calls, does not accept silence. The photo haunted him in dreams, in flashes between waking and sleep, and now, finally, he was here before the house that, according to a nearly illegible inscription on the back of the photograph, was the setting of that image. A date, a town's name, nothing more. Upon entering, the smell of damp wood and old irons surrounded him. The main hall opened like an abyss of shadows. The wide floorboards groaned beneath each step, and the air seemed to hold dust and memory in equal measure. Portraits lined the walls, and in every one of them, the same expression, fixed, distant, as if all the painted faces were waiting for something that never came, or someone who never returned. The man moved slowly, guided by a curiosity that mingled with unease. He didn't know what he was looking for, but he knew he wouldn't leave until he found it. Something in that house called to him from within, a voiceless echo of ancient breath. He climbed the stairs. The banister, worn by hands long gone, felt warm to the touch, a strange warmth, almost human. At the top, the corridor split into 3 wings, each one swallowed by dimness. He chose the left one, instinctively, as if his body remembered a path his mind had never walked. At the end of the hallway, a door stood slightly ajar. Inside, the air smelled of old fabric and dried flowers. It was a bedroom, with a large window covered by heavy curtains. The mirror on the vanity reflected only emptiness, but there was something peculiar about it. A faint mark where a frame had once been, and on the floor, near the wall, a small wooden box, unlocked, thinly coated in dust. He knelt, opened the lid, and found dozens of photographs like the one he carried, all old, all yellowed. But in every single one of them, there was the same face, a woman with a serene expression and deep, knowing eyes. Her name, scribbled beneath several of the images, was Clara, and in many of them, another figure, appeared, a young man, firm and solemn. In one photograph, they stood together, hand in hand, before that very same house. On the back, the same date as the first photo, and a single line, written in the same hand: "What is lost here, remains." The traveler's heart began to race. He didn't know what it meant, but he knew none of it was coincidence. The feeling of familiarity grew almost suffocating. It was as though, by looking at those faces, he was staring into echoes of himself, distorted reflections of a life he didn't remember living. Night began to fall. The sound of the wind intensified, and the mansion seemed to shrink in on itself, as though the weight of darkness made it breathe with effort. He lit an oil lamp he'd found on a table and sat on the floor, spreading the photos around him. He studied them for hours, observing every detail: the garden, the clothing, the faces, the shadows, until he noticed something strange, something his eyes had missed before. In the oldest photograph there was a reflection in the window glass, and in that reflection a figure, alone, watching. A chill ran down his spine. He lifted his gaze to the same window before him. The curtain trembled slightly, though the wind outside had gone still, and for an instant he had the clear impression that someone was watching him in return, not from outside, but from within the photograph itself. It was then he understood that the house, the pictures, and the past were bound together in ways time could not explain. And in that instant, without knowing it, he had crossed the point of no return. During that first night in the mansion, the silence seemed to have form, thick, almost tangible, as though the air was crowded with invisible presences. The man sat on the floor, surrounded by photographs, the trembling flame of the lamp painting restless shadows on the walls. Each photo seemed to shift subtly beneath that flickering light, as though the faces within were breathing softly. He stared at Clara's image with an attention that went beyond curiosity. There was something in her expression, a wounded serenity, an eye that seemed to carry the weight of a secret that drew him in like a silent magnet. It was the kind of face you recognize, even if you've never seen it before. A face that disturbs not because it's strange, but because it's too familiar. Around him, the house creaked like a living organism. The wind slipped through the cracks of the windows, sounding like whispers that repeated voiceless words. At times, he thought he heard footsteps soft-measured coming from below, but when he descended, lamp in hand, he found nothing but the echo of his own heartbeat. The kitchen was untouched, as if time itself had forgotten to pass there. Glasses lined up, plates stacked neatly. A clock forever frozen at the same hour, 3:17. The second hand trembled, but never moved. It was as if time itself were waiting for something, or someone to begin again. He shivered. Old houses, he thought, sometimes refused to forget. Returning upstairs, he noticed a small detail in the corridor, a fallen picture frame, glass shattered. Inside a photograph, different from the others, clearer, more recent. In it, the same woman, Claire, older now, seated by a window, her gaze distant. Behind her, the faint outline of a man, half hidden, just a fragment of his face, yet enough to stir a painful recognition. His throat tightened when he picked up the frame. The broken glass cut his finger, leaving a thin line of blood. Only then did he notice, in the background of the photo, the same reflection as before, a still figure standing in the window, watching, an eternal observer, crossing decades. The hours stretched on, and the lamp began to fade. Exhausted, he lay on the rug, surrounded by the images, and closed his eyes. But sleep never came. Only memories that weren't his own, distant laughter, the scent of lavender, the soft touch of a hand that seemed to know him deeply, and for an instant, he felt clearly that someone was leaning over him, not in threat, but in tenderness, a gesture near affection, yet heavy with the pain of something lost. When he awoke, the lamp was out, and morning light seeped through the curtains. The photographs, once scattered, were now neatly stacked beside him. On top of the pile, a new one he didn't remember seeing before. In it, Clara stood alone. But there was something deeply disturbing. She was wearing the same ring he had on his finger, an old silver ring with a dark blue stone one he'd been told belonged to his grandfather. What could it mean? How could a woman from another century wear the same ring? Discomfort mingled with an inexplicable pull. It was as if something inside him recognized her, not just her face, but her presence. And the house, with its murmurs and silences, seemed to understand and accept that wordless connection. Every corner, every wall, every photograph invited him to remember something trapped in the edges of memory. He spent the day exploring the rooms. The mansion was larger than it looked from outside. Vast halls, corridors ending in locked doors, stairways descending into dust-covered basements. In one, he found old books, notebooks, unsigned diaries, each filled with fragments about time, forgetting, and destiny. One passage, in particular, seemed written for him. What is loved too deeply? Time does not take, it keeps. That line echoed in his mind like a confession. And as afternoon faded into dusk, the house seemed to change color. The golden light from the setting sun turned the dust into a luminous shroud, as though the past itself were rising in suspended particles of light. And for an instant he swore he saw Clara. Not in a photograph, not in memory, but there standing in the hallway, looking at him with that same serene sadness. Her gaze wasn't frightening, it was sorrowful, and beautiful. He blinked and she was gone, but the air still held the scent of lavender. The man fell to his knees. Not from fear, but from recognition, because in that moment he understood something he couldn't explain. He loved her. He didn't know how or why, but the feeling consumed him with the force of something that did not belong to the present, an ancient love, buried in time, now breathing again. When night fell once more, he returned to the room of photographs. The lamp, which he was sure he'd extinguished, was burning again on the table, and beside it, upon the mirror, a new photograph. Not an old one, a recent one, taken in the exact same composition as the others. But in this one he was there, sitting on the floor holding the lamp, exactly as he was now. The cold swept through his entire body, because that wasn't a memory. It was the present, and someone, or something, was watching him from inside time. And in that instant he understood that the house wasn't merely the setting of the story, it was the story itself. And that perhaps Clara had never left, perhaps she had only been waiting for him to return. On the second night, fatigue brought no rest, only a feverish lucidity. The man wandered the mansion like one moving through a sleeping body, touching nerves and invisible scars. The recent photograph, the one in which he appeared seated, the oil lamp in his hand, no longer paralyzed him with astonishment. It drew him in with an inevitable logic, as if the house had merely answered a request he didn't remember making. The sensation of belonging rooted itself in him without asking permission, and the ring on his finger, cold as the metal of a memory, seemed to pulse in time with every step. That was when he noticed a crack in the baseboard of a lateral corridor, almost hidden behind a wardrobe pressed to the wall. The swollen wood betrayed ancient damp, and when he brushed the dust aside, it revealed a small iron ring, discreet as a secret that does not want to be found. He pulled it, and the panel gave way. The air that escaped had the astringent smell of forgotten chemicals, as if decades of silence had been preserved in jars. A narrow staircase descended into the belly of the house. The basement wasn't a basement, it was a studio. A long table occupied the back wall, covered with metal trays, tweezers, thick papers, glassware, labels with words from another age. Shelves held boxes of glass plates, notes with dates, exposure times, and small thumbprints pressed into darkened corners. From the ceiling, a trembling wire held a dim reddish lamp, as if it had kept a remnant of life inside the blackness. The man's skin rose in gooseflesh, not from fear but recognition. This was where images were born. This was where the house made time bleed into paper. On the stand, a bellows camera imposing lay beneath a dark cloth. He lifted the cover slowly, like unveiling a sleeping face. The dry leather creaked, and the lens, dulled by dust, returned a blind yet eager eye. On the table, a hardbound notebook waited. He opened it, leafing through pages where a decisive hand recorded exposures, failures, successes. Between measurements and formulas, stray lines surfaced, like confessions that slipped past technical rigor. Light knows what memory refuses. What I fix again returns sharper. If love is a binding, let the paper absolve me. There were dates, many, at the bottom edge of each entry, a sequence that began in a distant past and moved forward, as if someone had continued the inventory for decades. What struck him wasn't the span of time recorded, but the repetition of a number marked by a stroke. 3:17, the house's frozen minute. The instant when, for some reason, the blade of the past slid more easily over the present. He approached the shelves, took down one of the boxes, and found plates still virgin, separated by sheets of wax paper. His next movements were almost automatic, as if his hands knew what to do before his mind understood. He prepared the tray, poured the solution, fixed a plate in the holder. Each gesture was a kind of ritual. The house seemed to guide him without words, breathing ancient certainties at his back. He set the bellows, opened the lens toward the studio, and held his breath for an instant, as if that second were worth a century. The tired red lamp flickered when he bathed the plate in the developer. The world narrowed to the silent litany of revelation. Lines rose like cracks across the densest surface of time. The impression of a wall, the outline of the stand, the camera, the table, and then, slowly, a figure in a posture he recognized with a sorrowful exactness. Someone seated on the floor, surrounded by photographs, the lamp at his side. The present reached out to the image, and the image reached back, in a cycle that wasn't reflection but return. The face emerged by degrees until no doubt remained. It wasn't merely a record of what had been. It was the very capture of the instant that was capturing him. A loose sheet slipped from the notebook as he turned a page and slid to the floor. He picked it up. The paper bore a short text, dated a long ago decade, the ink holding on out of stubbornness. The note wasn't technical, it was a plea. When the image stops obeying, do not trust the light. Listen to the silence. And beneath it, a jagged signature and a word written twice like a request. Return, return. That insistence etched a certainty into him. The love that drew him toward Clara wasn't a romantic curiosity produced by chance. It was a continuous thread that had crossed the photographs and coiled around his finger in the shape of a ring. An object is not born tied to a body, but to a story. And the story insisted on calling him back to itself, as if unfinished. As if a love interrupted were asking for a second exposure to fix itself at last. Climbing back up, he perceived nuances previously invisible on the surface of the world. The corridor breathed. The portraits followed him with a patience that wasn't threat but expectation. In the room where the stack of photos slept, the pale nightlight traced soft shapes across the rug. He spread the images once more, this time attending to the margins as much as the lines. That was when he found, between two photographs glued by damp, a stiffer card, heavy stock with rounded corners and a dry embossed seal. It wasn't a photograph, it was a certificate. He turned it over with trembling hands, still scented of reagents. The document, impeccably written, bore the heading of a civil register from another era. The date fixed itself in his mind like a nail pressed in slowly, a century and a half ago. The hand left no room for doubt. A wedding performed in the old chapel on the hill, named witnesses, the mansion's address, the bride's name Clara, with the same surname that appeared beneath the photographs. The groom's name slid under his gaze for an instant, as if it refused to be caught by the mind. But time's insistence imposes its reading. The groom bore his name. The blow was not disbelief but recognition. Reality didn't shatter. It simply rearranged itself, pieces falling back into their native joints. The causeless aches of his life, the longing for a perfume he'd never learned to name, the tender weight of an inherited ring, everything found its place. The past ceased to be a foreign country and became the mother tongue he had forgotten how to speak. His frightened heart beat with a new serenity, like someone returning home. Sensing this reconciliation of destinies, the mansion changed temperature. The cold withdrew, making room for a warm current rising from the lower floor. He followed that breeze as one follows a summons. In the vestibule, he noticed for the first time the mosaic pattern beneath the dust, a geometric weave that seemed mere ornament, but, viewed from above, formed a compass rose pointing not north but toward the room where he had found the photos. The center of the design was shifted by millimeters, like a disc capable of turning. He knelt, touched the lines, and the sound that came was that of a mechanism aged by patience. The wall beside it, where a large family portrait hung, yielded inward by a centimeter, just enough to reveal a narrow gap. The portrait tilted like a heavy curtain, inviting passage. Behind it, a still older corridor, in flaking stone, sloped down gently. The air there was motionless but not putrid. It held the scent of resin, parchment, and something indefinable, perhaps the mute trail of those who had crossed that tunnel, afraid of being seen by the house itself. Each step echoed like a decision. At the end of the corridor, a door with a milky glass window waited. He laid his hand against the pane, and the chill that returned seemed to come not only from the material, but from the other side. The mansion's soul was there, guarded as if a child slept within. Beside it, a shelf held smaller boxes, like those in the studio, labeled with dates and the same surname repeated across decades, like a family signature. On the lid of one, a newspaper clipping was pasted with a headline drowning in old typography. Local photographer unites science and devotion to preserve the town's memories. He opened the door with the care of a man touching a taut rope. The room was a narrow hall lined with shelves of leather-bound albums, each spine stamped with a symbol in low relief. In the center stood a table draped in velvet. He drew the cloth back, revealing a single large frame under glass. It wasn't small. It was the size of an altar. The image, protected, showed the mansion's back garden on a day when the sky looked like melted silver. In the background, a line of sunnesses. In the foreground, two figures, the woman, as clear as every possible clarity, and the man in profile, offering his hand. The blue stone of the ring, touched by the pale light seeping through a top crack, shone on the woman's finger. The man's face, however, was slightly out of focus, as if the exposure had been broken by a trembling of the world. The gleam crossed the glass, found the ring on the observer's finger, and cast back into the room a reflection that joined distinct times with a single flicker. And then, as if obeying an order given long before, the lobby clock, sleeping at 3:17 since forever, moved its hand with a dry click to 3:18. The mansion breathed not as before, but with the strength of one waking from a very long sleep. A murmur climbed through corridors, ran the stairs, opened windows from within. The past, at last, had shifted, and with it, everything held motionless began to search for its place. Heat rose to the man's face, not fever, but presence. The love that until then had been a nameless nostalgia took on substance. It was no longer echo, it was voice, no longer memory. Destiny. He stretched his hand to the glass, and the outline of his palm, for the first time since he'd arrived, was met by the cold on the other side, as if there were no separation. Somewhere in the house, a metal latch turned without hands. A window upstairs closed softly. On the walls, portraits vibrated like taut strings touched by an inward breeze. And at the back of the hall, behind a stack of albums, a second door he had not seen yielded a few millimeters, revealing a dark, deep crack, like the source of an underground river. It was the threshold beyond which one does not return, the forbidden place where promises were kept like daggers. He knew without learning that on the other side lay the answers the photograph had come to demand. There, love would be tested by time, and death, if it still dared, would have to answer to the light. He drew a breath, feeling the house regard him with the impersonal tenderness of ancient walls. And before he touched the wood to open the way, the ring on his finger grew heavier in a new, more intimate way, as if an unseen hand, gentle and firm, had twined itself with his again. The crack waited, and the clock, awakened at last, began to count. The opening widened like a stone lip, exhaling a cold breath of resin and decades of dust. He pushed the door slowly, feeling the weight of time settle across his shoulders like a damp cloak. The space beyond was not wide, yet it seemed taller than it should have been, as though the ceiling was lost in a penumbra arranged to hide what should be seen only in fractions. Narrow rows of shelves formed corridors of shadow, and every album spine, every box, every label was set down with the silent obsession of someone who had collected not objects, but respirations. At the center, a low work altar bore a worn felt mat and old stains of silver nitrate. Upon it lay a stack of brown envelopes, each sealed and since broken, resting like a correspondence that never found its addressee. He lifted the first and opened it with the reverence of a hand touching an absent one's skin. Inside were thin, numbered sheets, a steady, austere script that demanded attention. They weren't reports, they were confessions. They spoke of light, of exposure, of a serene belief that the image could be more than a portrait, that it could be a thread of return, a bridge across the silent river dividing the living from those who had taken up residence in photographs. Between the technical lines, the text bent deeper, revealing a motive that was not science but mourning. The hand that wrote those pages claimed to have loved not once but every time the past allowed, and that the house had been raised like a vessel to preserve a perfume that insisted on fleeing. Clara's name surfaced and vanished, not as an object of study but as a center of gravity. In each entry, the same minute tolled like a bell without sound. 3:17. The moment when the world grows porous. His throat tightened. He read on not merely for curiosity, but because he recognized a rhythm that felt his own, as if his thinking, in another age, had traced those lines with the same delicate impatience. The sequence of envelopes led to a blue-covered notebook, scratched and scarred, buried beneath the stack like a lightly interred heart. When he opened it, his whole body trembled not with fright, but recognition. There were no equations there, but nights, no measures, but please. The notebook spoke of repeated attempts to fix the beloved's presence upon ever more sensitive emulsions and of how, in certain dawns, the image began to answer, not as a mirror but as a window. The pages described the very ritual he had just performed in the studio below. In one passage, the writing hand said it had seen the figure of a man at the very instant of developing, a man seated among photographs, an oil lamp at his side exactly as he had been caught by the image. In another, the hand noted that when the ring flashed beneath the red light, the plate grew denser, as if a muscle contracted on the other side. The word promise returned like a tide. Promise of return, promise of remaining, promise not to let love dissolve into the anonymous archive of time. As he read, the house adjusted its breathing. He could feel it in the touch of the pools, in the floor's reply, in the way the air changed temperature against his skin. The sense of watchfulness that once seemed lodged in the walls now came from the pages. The diaries watched. The letters, all unsealed, regarded him with writing so intimate it seemed to know more about him than he did. Doubt installed itself not as a frontal assault but as fog rising from the floor slowly climbing his legs. What if what brought him there was not the chance of a purchase at an antique market but a meticulous summons prepared by old hands that knew his steps before he took them? In a side compartment, a smaller album of cracked leather stood out. It had no title, only a symbol in relief, a small spiral, like a snail's. Inside, tiny portraits pasted with dark glue, margins annotated in the same hand. Clara appeared at various ages, always with that serene gaze that held, at once, desire and renunciation. In two images, the man beside her was deliberately out of focus, as if recognizing his face were dangerous. The ring, however, was always sharp. There was intention in this, a message that had crossed more than a century. The ring was the line. The knot light could not undo. At the back of the album, a detachable sheet hid a still-sealed envelope. Its wax bore the same spiral mark. He hesitated for an instant that felt longer than the stone corridor. He broke the seal with the ring's tip and drew out a letter written on translucent paper. No signature, no addressee, only a far-off date and a spare text, almost without adjectives, leaning toward prayer without ever becoming one. It said the house had been built as an instrument, like the body of an organ, to vibrate under certain frequencies of time. It said the photographs were not keepsakes, but doors kept ajar at the cost of silence and discipline. It said, finally, that none of it would hold without the weight of a promise spoken at the exact moment the clock above held its breath. The weight of that promise pressed from inside his chest. The romanticism of that somber architecture was not ornament, it was mechanism. Love here had been designed to survive with the coldness of an experiment, and yet that cold was warmed by a devotion that could not be feigned. A conflict began to throb, the desire to embrace the destiny the pages offered, and the suspicion that he was walking a path arranged to pin his steps to the same point forever. Were those old hands faithful to Clara or faithful to the house? What kind of fidelity demanded keeping life suspended between 3:17 and 3:18? The sensation of being watched intensified. He raised his eyes and found, high on the shelf, a small round aperture, discreet, aligned with the thickness of the wall, not a crack. Intention. On the other side, he imagined there would be a hidden room, a place from which one could watch the album haul without being seen. The thought settled in him with the chill of an animal choosing bones for a bed. The house didn't merely keep memories, it surveilled those who dared to touch them. Whom did that gaze serve, the protection of the sacred, or the maintenance of an invisible captivity? He walked the opposite row and found, among the volumes, one thicker than the rest, set back just enough to suggest it had been hastily returned. When he pulled it, a mechanism groaned in the baseboard and a panel slid aside, revealing a narrow recess. Inside, no stairs or corridors, only a chair facing the aperture, a table with drippings of wax, and a stack of negative plates. The observer's observatory. A discipline of decades, perhaps, centuries watching the precise point where the hands of the living touched a glass of images. Tension rose like lucid fever. It wasn't only love being preserved there, but the habit of binding what one loves. On the table, the plates held known and unknown faces, captured always at the same distance, the same almost ritual slowness. In two of them, the man himself appeared younger than in the mirror sitting on the floor of the photo room. The lamp beside him, the date in the corner, written in hard pencil, corresponded to dons he didn't remember living. His stomach clenched with a violence less nausea. The past wasn't merely returning, it was chasing him with hands full of proof. On the observatory floor, a narrow notebook like a private index carried curt entries of a single hour and a single word. 3:17 waiting, 3:17 approach, 3:18 passage. It repeated across the years with a fidelity worthy of a sacred rite. On certain days, a trembling line added beneath the date, 3:18. The word failure spread a different cold, as if in that minute something had crossed the glass incompletely, leaving a body divided between two waters. He returned to the main room with the notebook in hand, seeking in the lobby mosaic above the complicity of an explanation. His heart's rhythm changed time, as if training the body to yield to that liminal minute. His love for Clarentil, now a tender, non-negotiable recognition, was suddenly circled by a siege of questions. What, exactly, had she asked of the world to remain there, visible, touchable, belonging neither to past nor present? What promise had been required of the man of long ago, the one who bore his name, so that the spiral would keep turning? The answers perhaps slept in the wing, the corridor barred with its soft darkness. The house waited, bending inward like a patient ear. The clock above, reanimated, shoved the seconds along with almost human resolve. The hour approached. He knew that when the pointer's blade pressed again against the forbidden minute, something would ask to pass more strongly than ever. Destiny, sometimes, weighs exactly as much as a finger upon glass. In the last envelope of the stack, a single page weighted heavier than the rest. The text was short, the hand more tremulous, as if written in haste or under the heat of a fever. It said the spiral would hold only as long as the promise was stronger than fear, and that if fear prevailed, whatever crossed would no longer know to whom it belonged. At the foot, a dry instruction, almost cruel in its precision. When the hand touches 3:17, be in the room before the mirror, the ring exposed to the red light, and above all, do not look back. He closed his eyes for an instant, gathering in a single breath everything he desired and everything he feared. It was not possible to love Clara and retreat at the same time. It was not possible to advance without distrusting the house. The contradiction throbbed like a taut string about to sing. He climbed the stairs, counting his steps, feeling the floor measure his resolve. The banister warmed slightly as if an absent hand were guiding him. In the room, the lamp, obedient, flared again with a breath that was not wind. The house held its breath. The clock descended, second by second, toward the forbidden minute. And on the empty plate, already submerged in solution, an outline began to surface before the light even touched the ring. The darkened solution quivered like a sunken lake, and the shape that rose on the plate seemed to obey no gesture of the present. First it was only a mist scratching at the sensitive surface. Then, a delicate profile insinuated itself, as if the world were recalling a face from the rumor of some ancient memory. The man felt in his hands that faint vibration that comes when a forgotten name is about to be spoken. Before the hand of the clock reached the forbidden minute, the figure already existed, autonomous, as though it waited only 4 times a cent to be made whole. When, at last, 3:17 pierced the clock's breast, the plate thickened with light, and the blue stone on his finger answered with a cold gleam, tinting everything around him with a blue that did not belong to that dawn. The image fixed with a clarity that hurt. There, in the rectangle of silver and silence, Clara wasn't looking exactly at him, but at the place from which he watched her. There was no joy in that reunion, nor any astonishment. There was the weary recognition of one finishing a long crossing only to understand he had merely returned to where he started. The love perceived in that instant was not rapture, but persistence of fidelity that time, by bending so often, had converted into discipline. And yet something didn't fit. The framing showed the room with a detail the present denied. In the image, on the vanity lay a small bronze key with a broken tooth, resting on a linen handkerchief folded into a triangle. The man looked for the objects the negative indicated in the world before him. The handkerchief was there but not the key. The precise space that should have held it was marked by a clean shadow, like those that remain when the sun shifts and the object has already been removed. Once again, the photograph showed not what was, but what had been or what ought to be. The house returned a future past, a kind of misalignment that, far from poetry, smelled like a trap. Trying to decipher the world's delay, he went back to the forbidden corridor, guided by the echo of his own footsteps and the certainty that the missing key, if it existed, would entrust its presence to the same obsessive habits that guarded everything else. The shelves whispered when his fingers grazed their spines, and one volume, thinner than a missile, retreated a millimeter more than it should. The mechanism yielded, a hidden drawer opened, and there was the bronze key, exactly as in the plate, but worn by recent use, still powdered with the brittle dust of a hastily closed hiding place. Against the skin, the metal held a temperature that did not belong to the mansion's stone. It was warm, as if it had just left a hand. That realization summoned a new fear, more intimate than the fear of ghosts, the presence of another will contemporary, trained in the same routines of watching, hiding, revealing. Someone, besides him and besides Clara, worked the corridors with the discretion of those who had learned to breathe with the house. The secret observatory, the chair facing the aperture, the negative plates, everything pointed to a nameless custodian, a wakeful consciousness. The question took on a body. Whom did the guardian love? What, after all, was this vigilance trying to save? He took the key to the room of glass and velvet, where the great portrait glimmered under the pale light that leaked from above. Beside the central table, a small wall safe had escaped notice before, disguised by molding and shadow. The key slid in as if it had always awaited that gesture, releasing a soft, unshrilled click. Inside were a bundle of letters tied with a dark ribbon, an oval locket of dull silver, and a roll of vellum sketched in India ink. The letters bore dates spaced by irregular intervals, as if they were replies sent to someone who could no longer read. There were no names, only pronouns, as though to name were to upset the balance of a secret. The India ink drawing showed the house's plan, but it wasn't the plan common sense would expect. It was a cartography of time within the architecture. Points marked by symbols, precise notes indicating the hours at which each room best responded to memory's summons. In the center of the vestibule, the mosaic with the compass rose was drawn with heavier lines, and over it someone had written, in a reluctant hand, a single phrase: "North is what returns." Around it, arrows marked a path to the bedroom, to the studio, to the stone corridor. The observatory had its own symbol, a doubled spiral, and above it, in pale red, a single word: cost. That word lit a shallow fire in his gut. A payment was required. Then, if time yielded passage, it did not do so out of courtesy. The man intuited that the house charged not in the future nor in the past, but at the exact point where heart and image recognized one another. 3:17. On each possible day, until the body chose a side and the soul accepted the station or the crossing. The price, perhaps, was this continuous suspension that numbs the days. Perhaps it was greater, invisible, silently debited to another account. The letters, for their part, spoke of care in crossing. In many there were descriptions of small accidents, the hand that passes through only halfway, the voice that reaches the ear like a watery noise, the face that will not hold sharp and therefore traps the living in the studio longer than the skin can bear. The word failure returned with the regularity of a pebble in a shoe. In one passage, a sentence scratched in haste cut a lucid wound. Sometimes what comes back isn't who once was, it's who the other fears to find. The fear of betrayal began to peel away not from a desired body, but from love itself. To betray, there, would be to yield to the temptation of wanting more than the house allowed. It would be to force the portrait to open a door with no handle on this side. The oval locket, when opened, did not hold the painted miniature one might expect, but a piece of black glass smooth on one side, faintly rough on the other. Its surface reflected sickly, returning a watered image, the edges broken. On the back, etched with precision, the same doubled spiral as the observatory. The object seemed made to press against the skin, not to be looked at. The man set the glass against the ring, an impulse, more than a decision, and the clash of materials produced a dry heat. like two stones biting. A brief dizziness scratched at his sight, and for an instant the room seemed to step back a few paces, retreating with a child's shyness. In the silence that followed, a memory not his own crossed his chest. Feminine hands rounding a dresser's ribbon, a garden where rain began very fine, a promise spoken without voice at the exact moment the lobby clock held its breath. The memory did not smell of longing, it smelled of obligation. Replacing the locket, the man understood the object was a trigger. It didn't open doors, it tuned frequencies. The ring, the glass, the lamp, the minutes, everything was part of an orchestra that had to strike exact notes for love, at least, to be heard. And yet, like any music, it had its tense chords, its planned dissonance. It was in that region the Guardian worked, not to bar meetings, but to keep the house from yielding beyond what it could bear. The Guardian, therefore, served the house who served Clara. The question pulled another: what if the Guardian were himself, in some earlier fold, condemned to watch over himself, to keep the spiral turning? The plates with his face from dons he didn't remember living, the notes that anticipated his gestures, the body's rhythm matching the right everything imitated the cruel elegance of circular fates. To love Clara might also mean to watch himself forever. To love, then, would be a form of servitude that language can neither reach nor absolve. When he returned to the room, the world seemed to have shed a layer of noise. The walls, obedient, kept their distance. The lamp burned with the discipline of a trained heart, and the mirror held, on its slightly darkened skin, the marks of what it had seen pass through. At the center of the vanity, beside the triangular handkerchief, the clean shadow where the key should have been had dissolved into the presence of the object, as if time, satisfied, adjusted its mask to the proper face. The newly developed photograph, propped upright, became a quiet witness to the provisional reconciliation between minutes. Even so, the signs that something wrong had grown fond of the mechanism increased. Touching the plate's edge with his fingertip, the man felt a roughness that wasn't a flaw in the paper but the texture of a deep scratch, as if an impatient nail had tried to claw the image from the inside out. On the back, a mark he hadn't seen on any other. 3 short, parallel grooves, joined by a slanting line, a symbol, a signature, a warning. He remembered the India ink sketch, the word cost, and the pale red with which it had been written. The Guardian, or whoever it was, had hands. The town below, invisible from the window, seemed to cough up a rumor of bell towers without an hour. The night, stretched to the point of transparency, let him hear the tiniest sound of dust falling, like old snow unthreading the ceiling of time. The letter spoke of a similar sound before failed attempts at passage. His body recognized the omen-like fever on a far horizon. The house wasn't merely awake, it was hungry to decide. In the studio, a plate he had not prepared demanded his attention with an oily sheen under the red light. Across its surface, stains were slowly arranging themselves like a graphic murmur. It wasn't a face, it was a space. A stone corridor, a door with a milky window, a table with a velvet cloth. The album room was developing by itself, as if the world had chosen to reveal itself. At the center, though, there was a new shape, the silhouette of a person seen from behind, motionless, gazing at the great garden frame. The shoulders were narrow, the nape bare. The outline of the hair was pinned in a pattern the man recognized as if it were a mark on his own wrist. It was Clara's silhouette. His heart made an old gesture one doctors call arrhythmia and the superstitious call an omen. Was Clara where the letters promised she would be? Or was the house, generous and cruel, reproducing a memory that wasn't his to lead him as one leads a gentle animal? The love that had seemed a muscle of persistence now throbbed like a question. To go on was to accept a game whose board never showed itself whole. To turn back was to betray something older than fear. He carried the photograph to the mirror. He joined the edge of the image to the border of the frame, like someone trying to overlay 2 windows to see the same garden from inside and out. The lamp made the silver quiver, and for an instant the glass returned, not his face, but the stone corridor, the figure seen from behind, the frame with the garden. The image, in that sickly reflection, seemed a lens aligned with another, multiplying infinity into darker and darker miniatures. At the heart of that repetition, something moved. Not a shape, not a wind. Touch. The sensation was clear. A very light hand rested on his shoulder, warm and tender. The kind of gesture that dares only when it knows it won't be refused. He turned his face just enough not to break the alignment between photograph and mirror. And he knew without looking that the house had, for a rare moment, allowed the impossible. He was not alone. But before his mind could name that presence, a detail cut his breath. In the reflection, The ring on his finger bore a scratch his ring did not have. A small diagonal scar in the metal non-existent in the world, evident on the reflected surface. The discovery was a thin nail sliding slowly into the silence. The photograph fluttered at the edge not by his hand, but by the air's decision. The reflection shifted a degree, and Clara's shape, seen from behind, tilted her head in the image. For a heartbeat, the shadow of a key sketched itself upon the triangular handkerchief. The overlay returned to its starting point. On the floor, a smaller album he hadn't noticed before waited, its leather cover nearly smooth, without symbols. When he opened it, he found blank pages for many leaves, until the center where a single mounted image received him with the delicacy of a dagger wrapped in silk. In the photograph, he and Clara stood in profile, their hands almost touching, before the garden frame. The ring on his finger showed the diagonal scratch. At the base of the card, the date, calmly handwritten, was a tomorrow that had not yet dawned. The house held its breath at the exact instant the clock, in the vestibule, began once more to march toward the forbidden minute, and above his head, a single footstep crossed the ceiling with the discreet conviction of one who knows the entire path. Dawn Wade. Time seemed to breathe differently, more measured, more lucid, as if the world had stepped back to watch from outside. The man stood before the photograph that showed tomorrow. The ring in the reflection, with its diagonal scratch, was the only proof that reality, at some level, was starting to warp. Nothing in his body hurt. And yet there was a kind of motionless vertigo as if he were floating above an abyss, forming slowly, without sound. The house followed his breathing. Every creak of the floor seemed to answer his heart's tempo. The windows groaned, not from wind, but from an inward motion, as if something moved behind the walls, searching the seams for air. The clock, now awake and impatient, grew louder, marking seconds with an irregular cadence, as though time were learning to walk again. In the mirror, the image of the room wavered between what it was and what it remembered having been. At times the curtains seemed different, shorter, or heavier. At others, the rug looked replaced. It was as if the mansion reorganized itself with every blink, adjusting to the memory of whoever looked at it. He felt the space growing conscious of its own observation, and then, the sound came. Not footsteps, not wind, something deeper, a subterranean murmur, as if the house had veins through which an ancient liquid ran. It came from the basement, from the studio, the same place where the first portrait had revealed itself. He went down slowly with the lamp, each step making an echo that seemed to fold inside his own ear. In the air, a smell of iron and sulfur, the same smell that hangs after lightning strikes, but trapped underground. The studio awaited him. The table covered with trays, now held new plates arranged in precise order, as if someone had worked there recently. The solutions were still wet, yet he did not recall touching them. The red light flickered, casting slow-moving shadows on the walls, imitating human gestures. He drew closer and looked at one of the plates. It showed his own face, sleeping on the rug of the bedroom. Another showed the staircase, with the silhouette of a woman standing at the top. Her body was only a gray blur, but the outline of her hands was so sharp one could almost feel their warmth. Fear returned like a breath of ice, but with it came something deeper, recognition. That presence, the same that had touched his shoulder in the mirror, was not strange to him. She had been with him for a long time, and now at last she allowed herself to be revealed. On the table lay a new notebook he hadn't seen before. Its pages were blank, save the first, which read in fresh ink, for when time forgets to distinguish before from after. The handwriting was the same as the letters, but the tone was different, more intimate, closer to supplication than instruction. And at the edge of the page, a smear of silvered fingertips, the trace of whoever had written it. He turned the leaf. There, the text was more personal, almost confessional. The image completes only when the heart yields. There is no return once memory is crossed. The reflection is not what is seen, but what remains of what has already been seen. Those lines fixed in him like thorns. Everything in the house seemed to say the same thing, that love is not lost, but neither does it move. It only repeats. As he read, he realized the room's shadows were no longer still. They curved, as if watching. In the sheen of a tray, the glass showed behind him a figure. When he turned, nothing was there, but in the reflection, she remained. Clara, standing motionless, with the same serene gaze that pursued him in the photographs. It wasn't a full apparition, nor was it an illusion. She stood between what the world allowed and what the house sustained. His heart swung between the sacred and the insane. The emotion was so intense he could barely breathe. And for the first time, he didn't try to flee. He let himself stay. He allowed the presence to draw near, even as his body shivered with cold. Clara's image crossed the air like a memory being breathed into living flesh. Her face did not age, did not smile, did not speak, but her eyes knew him. And in that instant, he understood what the house demanded. It was not enough to look, he had to surrender to the memory until he became part of it. The ring shone, the lamp faltered, and for a heartbeat, his shadow and hers touched upon the wall. Only a heartbeat, but enough for the house to breathe in relief. The gesture exacted a price. When he blinked, Clara had vanished, and the room around him was no longer the same. The ceiling seemed lower, the furniture, in other places, the curtain, another color, and the mirror now cracked. In the split glass, no longer the present, but another night, another man, another lamp, an echo, a fragment of a time that hadn't been waiting for him. The lobby clock began to strike 3:17 again, but the sound was different now, faster, more impatient, like a heart on the verge of collapse. And in that sound, the man understood that the cycle wasn't repeating, it was accelerating. Something had been awakened before its time. The photographs on the table began to stain. The images trembled, melting into liquid shadows. Clara disappeared within them, swallowed by the paper itself. And on the wall, the two shadows, his and hers, slowly separated until only one remained. His fear returned, but now it had a shape, that of being the last to remember, of being the guardian who once loved so much he forgot to die. The floor of the studio vibrated, as if the house's heart were beating beneath the boards. The trays trembled, the liquid bubbled up, and the air grew heavy, saturated with living memories. And then he heard the whisper, not from the house, but from within himself. A voice so near it seemed a thought or a prayer. Love doesn't save, it binds. The sound made the air shudder. That was when he caught the reflection of something in the bellows camera's lens. A new face. Distant, watching, and it wasn't Clara. It was his own. Older, paler, with the tired gaze of one who has waited too long. The house was finally beginning to show its truth. It didn't keep memories, it kept versions. And every love that entered left behind a shadow to serve as witness. Clara had only been the first, he would be the next. The clock's hand moved once more, 3:18, and the oil lamp went out. Darkness fell without clamor, like a piano lid descending with delicacy to seal the final note. The instant the lamp died, the studio seemed to fold in on itself. The man kept still, measuring his own breath, while the mineral reek of the reagents thickened to the edge of nausea. It wasn't merely an absence of light, it was an absence of world. And within it, an uncomfortable certainty stirred like an animal waking. This was no mishap of chance, but a calculated signal from the house's mechanism. When his eyes learned the coarse outline of the dark, a faint phosphorescence, almost imaginary, began to trace the path back to the stone corridor. The damp wall offered a cold that seemed to think. He guided himself by touch, skimming his fingertips over rough plaster, sometimes feeling small metal nubs hidden beneath the lime. The Indian claw plan, etched into memory, said that beyond the album hall there would be a second tier, undrawn, a territory of corrections, where time was repaired as one repairs clocks, opening, adjusting, charging a fee. The bronze key bit into a lock that had never shown itself. The wood yielded, and a steep staircase, narrower than prudence would advise, opened the house's throat downward. The air there was different, not the surface dust, but a dry citrus scent, like new leaves crushed between ancient pages. The descent was short and long at once, for the uneasy mind lengthens any path. At the bottom, a low, vaulted room received a light that came from nowhere the eye could name. There were no trays or plates set out, only tables lining the walls with things that weren't tools so much as relics of a method. Among them rested a huge book, bound in dark leather, its spine reinforced with 3 iron clamps. On the cover, in low relief, the doubled spiral. Beneath it, a title that wasn't a title, Book of Promises. He didn't need to force it. The volume yielded to his touch the way a chest yields to its first sob after a fright. The thick pages bore names, dates, and a column of bare notes. No adjectives, no rhetoric. It was a registry office of devotion. The entries began in a remote century and climbed nearly to the present, stopping where the handwriting grew too familiar. His eye ran over known places, the chapel on the hill, Clara's name repeating at irregular intervals, the minute 3:17 stamping signatures like an invisible seal. At a certain point, the text ceased to record weddings, baptisms, deaths. It began to record passages. Each entry ended with 2 columns, cost and result. The shock came without violence, with the sharpness of things always in plain sight. His name not, the one of now, but the one he bore in older documents appeared as bridegroom in one line, and pages later, as the contractor of a passage. Under cost, the same word returned, sparingly, as if the hand refused to embellish pain. Presence under result, conciliation and failure alternated. On some dates, a curt aside edged between the columns, forced fixing, distorted reflection, incomplete return. Love had been turned into protocol, and protocol into habit. Then he found an interleaved sheet of thinner paper pinned with a rusty tack. It bore no names, only a dry narrative, almost a chart. It said that, on a stormy night, the contractor led the beloved to the studio and, at the exact minute the clock held its breath, exposed the plate to the light, the ring returned. It said that the crossing thus fixed took for itself something that was indeed its own, the last breath. The word seemed written with another penthica, as if the hand had shaken not from weakness, but from shame. The text did not accuse, but it stated, Clara's staying in the house was less a miracle than a seizure. The thought didn't stab, it recognized. He didn't see himself as a melodrama's villain, but as one who, loving too much, did what he believed necessary to stave off erasure. If there was a crime, it lived in that logic. Saving had become binding. Love, trained into discipline, had changed vocabularies without warning. And what if the guardian wasn't a third party? What if the guardian was simply the part of him that never consented to accept death? The studio as altered to a private cult. The key as host. The locket as a small cross. The entire house as the ribcage of a decision. At the foot of the page, a tiny line almost hid among the fibers. If ever the contractor forgets, the house itself will remember in his stead. The phrase crossed his chest with the cruel gentleness of a truth that will not fade. He understood then the logic of the advanced reflections, the photographs that showed future mornings, the scratch upon the ring that did not yet exist. The house was training tomorrow to replay it as yesterday. The future wasn't a promise, it was a script. The turn didn't announce itself with drums, it came as a silent refusal. He closed the book, and the thump of leather meeting would sounded like a no learned late. If love required imprisonment to exist, it wasn't love, it was panic. If Clara lived on paper at the cost of a stolen breath, that wasn't return, it was taxidermy of memory. The decision arranged itself within him as if a new muscle had formed in the heart. It wasn't renunciation of her, it was renunciation of the method. To love henceforth would mean to give back what had been taken. The next gesture seemed to come from another body. His hand found the oval locket, opened it, and when the dark glass touched the ring, it repeated the dry heat from before, now with a short, almost inaudible crack, as if two dissonant notes collided. The diagonal scratch, which in the photograph of tomorrow cut the metal, appeared in the world with the sound of a nail scraping stone. He had made the scar tomorrow had promised, not because the house demanded it, but because he chose to tear the continuity. From that instant, the mansion began to suffer a misfit, not a collapse, but a going out of tune. The lobby clock, which had once threatened to collapse from impatience, fell silent. The windows forgot to groan in the same places. Under the oblique light that always slipped through invisible seams, the mosaic floor seemed to shift its center a millimeter left. The portraits, hanging from their nails, showed the faintest turn of the neck that hadn't been there before. For the first time, the house didn't know which music to play. He carried the book of promises upstairs like a body brought to the sun. In the vestibule, he laid it on the central table. The living leather seemed to reject the pale light from above. He opened at random to a page where Clara's name repeated in scribbled margins, not of devotion but of anxiety. There, in tiny letters, a note with no addressee. If ever it can be undone, the one who loves undoes it. The hand, though old, pulsed young. At any cost, the phrase lit a place in the mind that belonged neither to knowledge nor to belief, but to care. The forbidden corridor that led to the album hall returned the echo of footsteps that were not his. Not hasty, not furtive. Steps of someone who never needed to hide, for they walked only when the house allowed it. The observatory was lit without light present, without needing to be seen. In the round hole of the wall, a wet gleam suggested an eye. The guardian, then, wasn't a shadow. It was a person or an intention given body, and whatever it was, it sensed the decision. It did not retreat, it changed the time. In the studio, the trays that minutes earlier had shuddered on their own now showed a new kind of calm, the calm of waters before a dam breaks. On the table, the photograph of tomorrow, the one where he and Clara nearly touched hands before the garden frame was beginning to pale at the corners, as if the silver were slowly giving up its hold on the scene. This giving up wasn't destruction, it was a sad courtesy. He understood that by tearing the continuity he wouldn't erase the past, but return to it its mortality. The risk lay then in the body. The book taught that every correction demanded cost, and the cost column rarely accepted new words. If the house had charged presents for decades, what would it charge one who refused the debt? The question didn't make him waver, it merely straightened his spine. The ring weighed heavy, and beneath the metal his skin burned with a strange dignity, the kind that comes only when a choice has no applause. He gathered what he knew: the ring as focus, the locket as tuning, the mirror as boundary, the forbidden minute as fold. To undo, he would have to unconduct the right, invert the gesture in the time of the gesture, expose the glass to darkness at the instant the house demanded light, offer silence when the mechanism asked for a name. The method sounded nearly absurd, but the mansion, in its newborn dissonance, seemed vulnerable to invention. In the bedroom, the vanity waited with the triangular handkerchief perfectly folded, the bronze key resting as if it had always belonged there. The mirror kept the scar brought from another neater fine fracture running the surface like an airy river. He set the photograph of tomorrow against the frame, touched the locket to the ring, and in the contagion of metal felt heat translate into impulse. There was no lamp, he had refused it. The clock, silent, offered no guide. The minute, therefore, would not be given, it would have to be created. The body, trained by the house, knew the tempo anyway. His heart beat like a conductor without an audience, marking inwardly the cycle that had so often imprisoned him. He closed his eyes and, on the dark of his lids, raised an image not of Clara, but of the air between them. He loved that emptiness as if it were skin. He loved the distance as if it were the promised touch. He loved the space the way one loves the other's freedom. And in that unthinkable act, loving what separates the mansion made a new sound, a crack not of wood, but of pact. The fissure in the mirror widened a hair, like the beginning of a smile deferred a lifetime. The photograph of tomorrow trembled on its edge and, for an instant, showed not two figures about to touch hands, but an empty garden. Cypresses still. Silver light. Nothing else. The emptiness had a devastating beauty. Emptiness did not bind. Emptiness returned. Then presence filled the room, not as apparition, not as shadow, but as the cessation of lack. Eyes that had hunted shapes accepted the shapeless. The lavender scent thinned, not from evaporation, but from having become air. And at the rim of that almost, one last memory rose with the sweetness of a mature farewell. Two hands that once touched wholly at the foot of the not promise event. He understood the scene no longer needed repetition to exist. At that point, the house reacted the way bodies do when they must choose between breathing and screaming. The vestibule mosaic turned a degree. Doors yielded inward. The portraits tilted in unison. The observatory, behind its false wall, struck the chair on the floor. The cost, at last, came to claim its line. It asked for no blood, no knees. It asked for restitution. He carried the book of promises to the mirror and, with the spine, touched the fissure. The glass accepted the approach like an animal accepting its first caress after a long fright. The crack that followed was clean, almost joyful. The fracture multiplied into discrete webs, each new line a small, golden liberty. When the first shard fell, it returned to him a reflection without tricks, only a tired man, a scratched ring, an open locket, an ordinary room. That sight hurt more than all the others, because it stripped away the tragic glamour captivity gives its devotees. At last there was the possibility of a life without rights. He nearly recoiled. He nearly begged the house to sing the old score, but the decision had already been written within him. And as with any decision that alters the inner world's course, it arrived with company. Footsteps in the corridor, now unhidden. The feet of someone light, decided, approached with the naturalness of those who have a right. The guardian came, either to restore the old music or to prevent the molt now threatening the spiral. He understood. He stood at the brink of an irrevocable choice. The book weighed in his arms with the gravity of a whole story asking for a new verb. The photograph of tomorrow, still propped up, was fading at the edges. The ring, scarred, burned like a fresh wound in night air. He raised the locket with a precision born not of anger but of pity, aiming at the join between glass and frame. And exactly as the object began to fall, the clock, which had chosen silence in protest, decided on its own to hold its breath. 3:17, invented by disobedience. The doorknob turned, and on the other side, someone the house seemed to have waited decades for pushed the door inward. The door opened with the naturalness of an old gesture, the way one returns to a room where the dust knows the visitor's name. He held the locket mid-air, the book of promises braced to the frame, the cracked mirror, breathing like a cornered animal, and, Then he saw what the house had upheld for decades. Not a stranger, not an intruder, not a stray shadow, but a version of himself worn down by light and habit. The Guardian was not an other. It was the body of the future the spiral had been training represented to the present with the chill of a method that does not err because it repeats. The realization didn't frighten, it fit. The stature was the same, the weight of the shoulders equal, the tilt of the hands identical to one who has learned to turn thick pages without tearing them. The difference lived not in the features, but in the gaze. Eyes taught to love as if loving were polishing a lens, patient, cautious eyes that confuse care with captivity. On his finger, the scratched ring, the diagonal scar exactly like the one he himself had carved moments before. At the wrist, an almost imperceptible tremor, one who listens more than acts, records more than lives. The house, satisfied, seemed to rest for a second, as if it had finally found its order again. There was no lunge, no melodramatic clash of muscle. The meeting happened in the thickness of the invented minute, where the doubled spiral learns to breathe without a clock. He faced himself like one beholding the photograph missing from the album, a late portrait that explains every earlier image, and with painful clarity he perceived the arithmetic of the mechanism. The Guardian was the inevitable result of yielding, day after day, to the right that promised to return Clara without accepting the wound of absence. To love without finitude here had become synonymous with keeping watch. The body from ahead moved little, just enough for the room's arrangement to reveal itself as a map of habit. The vanity set back a step, the lamp he had chosen not to light. The book laid always at the point where the arm does not tire. The photograph of tomorrow tilted at the angle silver light recognizes and obeys. Each detail was a lesson taught to bone. The house, complicit, adjusted the air. The vestibule mosaic turned a hair without sound, like straightening a crooked frame by reflex. The spiral, stubborn, tried to recompose the score. Then something outside the calculation interfered. The ownerless memory of two hands touching once, at the foot of the cypresses, with no witness and no plate. Not a ritual, not a technique, not a passage, but an event which, precisely because it was mortal, remained whole. This memory did not pull him back into the right, it pushed him a step beyond. With brutal tenderness he recognized that the love that binds was smaller than the love that returns. The Guardian, made of routine, trembled within the way structures tremble when they hear. For the first time, a music without time signature, Clara's presence drew near, not as figure but as temperature. The perfume that had been a signature dissolved into an air without sign. The room lost its borders for an instant, and in the middle of that blur he grasped the topography of the cost. If he undid the method, he would lose the company of reflections, the discipline that cradled his days, the certainty of seeing Clara at every 3:17. No gain could promise anything except the truth. Absence, breathing free, time unbound, memory without frame. The Guardian, sensing this shift, tilted his head with a sadness that had no theater. There was no malice in that look. There was fear. Fear, however, had learned too well. The trained body stepped back, set an invisible chair, measured the distance from frame to chest, and positioned, in the air, the mental replica of a lamp. The gesture, empty of object, still had power. The house, so often obedient to outline, almost ignited. The man, alert, understood the spiral was sustained less by things than by repetition. He needed then to break not only the glass, not only the book, but the gesture. Unlearn with the body, disobey with the muscle. He lowered the locket, he opened the book of promises in the middle, as one bears a flank, and did not read, did not interpret. He simply breathed. He taught his chest a cadence without measure, refusing the secret count the house tried to impose. Then he performed the movement no page had ever foreseen. He turned his back to the mirror. He loved the reverse of the portrait. He extended his hand not toward the glass, but into the opposite air where nothing was. Absence, for a second, returned warmth, not the warmth of a thing, not the warmth of a person, but the temperature of acceptance. The Guardian, not made for that choreography, lost the beat. The lobby clock choked on its silence. In the stone corridor, the album hall shifted the weight of centuries, 1 centimeter aside. Covers creaked without hands. Plates touched edges with the sound of shells. The observatory behind the wall released a sigh. The stored negatives rose in the mind like small silver storms, ready to adhere to the first command. He sensed that if he faltered, habit would reclaim the body out of kindness. The Guardian, before him, gathered in a single look the years trained to restart the ceremony, and the ceremony, delicate and patient, extended a wordless invitation. The scratched ring pricked his skin. The open locket weighed like a sentence. The book, lying down, seemed to breathe. The photograph of tomorrow, already pale, insisted on showing, in its last clarity, a silent garden with no figures, as if the world there had decided life was enough. He anchored himself in that vision, the beauty of a place without summons, without tricks, without extension, and he knew the climax would not be one triumphing over the other. It would be a renunciation made in love before himself. He walked to the threshold of the forbidden corridor, not to flee, but to feel the full weight of what he was giving back. The aligned albums formed the mansion's spine, each spine a vertebra, each plate a nerve. The book of promises in his hands was the skull. If he threw it to the floor, there would be noise, shatter, a revolt of dust, but noise does not correct music. The house, even wounded, could reassemble its score with the stubbornness of those who know the refrain. The choice then took another form, not to destroy but to deaden, to dislodge the minute, to unsettle the meter, to teach the body to remember at different hours outside, the sacred 317. In the vestibule, the mosaic waited like an instrument that tolerates a change of key. He knelt, ran his hand over the shifted compass rose, found the iron key beneath the movable center, and turned it not to lock, but to enter. The bearing, obedient, rotated one step east. The house's axis moved. A light vertigo ran along the walls, climbed the stairs, opened doors falsely. In the studio, the red lamp tried to reignite, then died. In the bedroom, the cracked mirror seemed, for an instant, to accept its imperfection as its definitive surface. The guardian, haunted by an unknown with no object, raised his hand to the ring like someone seeking a reflection and finding only skin. Between the shelves, the oval locket quivered in his pocket, looking for anchorage. He took it out and noticed that the dark glass now returned not a face, but a cloudless sky. There was no mystic message in that void. There was an ethic. The object that had always tuned frequencies now offered silence. It was the tool refusing the work that had exceeded it. Grateful for the metal's fatigue, he set the locket upon the book, as if sealing a letter that would not be sent. For a minute without a number, the world lost its reference, deprived of its reference, deprived of its ritual north. The mansion tasted a state of near childhood. The past, untracked, lost its rush to repeat. The future, without a promise, gained the dignity of the unknown. It was in that interval that Clara appeared not as presence, not as image, not as perfume, but as a gap filled with meaning. A brief, deep contentment without spectacle crossed his chest with the force of a late acceptance. Love could finally be mourning and, therefore, be whole. The guardian, facing the scene, understood, not with joy, not in defeat, but with the relief granted only to one who realizes he has been for years the priest of an altar that needed no cult. The trained body disarmed. Fingers that knew by heart the height of the frame lost their function. The clock, somewhere above, tried to hold its breath, failed, and released a second that wasn't the usual one. 317 unraveled like a half-remembered word. At the center of the album hall, an old spine cracked. An album slid from the shelf with the discreet sound of loosened snow. It opened on the floor by itself, as books do when they know what must be shown. The image revealed was not a face, nor a garden, nor a corridor. It was a white rectangle, pure with a faint gray corner washed thin like a first brushstroke on a canvas that hasn't begun. He understood the invitation, not the repetition of what was, not the promise of what will be, but the page of no one. He closed his eyes, inhaled, felt with spacious gratitude, the house learning to be quiet. And when he opened his lids, the spiral's last insistence manifested as a blow of air. The shadow of a hand climbed the wall with no body to cast it and rested exactly over the mirror's fissure, pressing it as if testing the strength of thin ice. The pressure wasn't a threat, it was a question. The guardian lifted his face. The scratched ring shone a thread. The locket on the book exhaled a stone warmth, and the mosaic below creaked a centimeter west like soil being readied for a definitive decision. The nameless minutes stretched until it nearly broke. The house, in its entirety, stood on the blade's edge. And in the stone corridor, something began to come down the steps from a place where the past usually went up. What descended had no hurry. The sound was contained, precise, without the hesitation of those who don't know the house. With each step, a grain of dust rose and fell, as if gravity were changing its mood slightly to receive the visitor. The man stayed still. The book of promises opened like a wound that no longer bleeds. The locket resting on the leather like a tired eye. The guardian, his version, trained by tomorrow, retreated half a span, not from fear, but out of respect for the symmetry of a ritual being dismantled. A mansion, between a sigh and a sob, learned to hear silence as substance. The figure appeared at the lip of the stone corridor, not Clara, not a stranger. It was the man's body in an intermediate time bent by zeal, silver under his nails, a shoulder marked by the habit of carrying albums, and in between, a fold, a link the method had produced so that someone would always be watching. There was a serene wherein that faced the serenity of those who completed the task without ever asking for its meaning. He held a plate wrapped in cloth, as if a lesser sacrament. On his finger, the ring with its diagonal scratch shone with the dignity of a guilt that had learned etiquette. He didn't advance. He let the air recognize 3 versions of the same man in the same room, and that recognition arranged the lines of space like the adjustment of an old mantle's seam. The house, seeing itself, gathered a little of its shadow. The vestibule mosaic downstairs paused its minute rotations. The clock, despite the temptation, did not attempt to invent 3:17. For the first time in decades, time refused instruction. He understood the climax would not be summoned by ritual, but by the refusal of ritual. The wrapped plate was laid upon the table with altar-like respect. When the cloth was lifted, there appeared not a face, nor a garden, nor a corridor, but an almost empty surface with a translucent line through its center, like the mark of a tide on sand. It wasn't a failed image. It was a negative of absence. Along the lower edge, the old hand had written a single word, restitution. The in-between had brought that peace with humility, like someone returning a key. The multiple presence of the same man tilted the air inward, and then the album hall responded, opening of its own accord a sequence of spines, as if backbones were popping after years of watch. The pages that opened showed photographs without figures, empty rooms, the iron stair with no steps upon it, the window without a curtain, the cypress garden with wind and nothing. It was an inventory of what would become possible if the house unlearned its imposition of presence. The guardian, before that cartography of emptiness, faltered. The gesture, accustomed to polishing lenses, lost its purpose. The in-between, with the weight of discrete years upon his shoulders, leaned slightly, as one asks leave of his own fate. The man who had chosen to deaden the score saw in the two of them the chance for a cageless reconciliation, not to destroy what they had been, but to welcome what they would no longer be. In the bedroom, the cracked mirror kept its drawing of fine rivers across the surface. The photograph of tomorrow, now almost fully faded, held as a last stubbornness the pale outline of 2 hands about to touch. He brought the book close and turned the pages with the slowness of changing a dressing. There, in a passage where the old handwriting had been forced to confess, lay a note no one had wanted to read. Clara's last breath was taken with the metal at the precise instant. Love confused itself with survival. The house learned the trick. The line did not accuse, it merely recorded, and in recording, it loosened the air from centuries of judgment. The decision needed a body now, not more conviction. He took up the locket and pressed the dark glass to the ring, not to summon light, but to gather back the tuning he had once forced. The dry heat repeated itself, but in reverse. A fine cold replaced it almost at once, like water changing current. The guardian shuddered, as one feels a familiar cord slacken. The in-between lowered his eyes, relieved like an old clerk returning a key at last. The stone corridor exhaled cleaner air without resin. The studio below tightened its jaws and let the chemical smell become only memory. There remained still the gesture that would make the house admit mortality. Instead of seeking the mirror's glass, the man sought the mosaic. He went down to the vestibule with the unencumbered solemnity of one making unrepeatable what had always been repeated. The compass rose, displaced, waited like a heart out of time. He touched the movable center with his thumb, felt the mechanism hesitate, and turned the disc in a direction no drawn plan had ever foreseen. Not east, not west, but to a point that does not exist on the maps of those who believe in cardinal points. The house did not understand, and not understanding, it let go. The sound that followed was not loud. It was discreet, domestic, like pots being shifted on a shelf. The walls adjusted their tendons. The doors settled their frictions. The ceiling drew back a centimeter to breathe. The portraits, still tilted, earned the right to remain askew. The clock, not knowing which minute to serve, opened its chest to the possibility of keeping ordinary hours. The album hall closed itself a little, like one protecting an archive already consulted. The studio wrung out its red, letting the lamp rest. The bedroom, with its vanity, its fissure, its triangular handkerchief, offered itself as a place of life, and not only of right. The mansion accepted, at last, the competence of the day. The guardian, who had always been the sum of habits, laid down his post with the dignity of those who understand. He didn't vanish in a trick. He didn't dissolve into air. He simply tired. The gesture that regulated lamps, the ear trained to the forbidden minute, the gaze that measured reflections gave way to the body's weight. A long breath, not of defeat, but of restitution, loosened his shoulders. The in-between, like a pupil returning the lesson to his teacher, left the negative of absence on the table and withdrew into gentler shadows. And the man who had chosen restitution understood that the only guardian remaining would be ordinary care, the living. Watch over what they love without intending to eternalize it. Down below, the town remembered it had its own dawn. A dog barked far away, and that bark, filtered by the hill, crossed the house with the unsupernatural sweetness of human noise. The mansion, once a shell pressed 2 times ear, became a window. The wind, no longer obliged to carry messages, swept the seams and took with it the old scent of lavender, leaving in its place the almost invisible smell of linen drying. The promise was no longer a rope. It was a loose thread in a pocket. Even so, love did not vanish with the rite. It became sharper and humbler. He returned to the bedroom and found in the mirror not Clara's figure nor his own projected forward, but a space that returned exactly what stood before it. Walls would glass, the fine scar scratched into the ring, the dust dancing in the breath the dawn exhales. Accepting that simple reflection was the hardest act. A sudden temptation rose to tilt his head, to search for the angle where memory repeats the desired face, to summon the old perfume with lunged insistence. He did not. He remained, and in that remaining, the beloved presence found another form, not a visible form, but the intransferable contour of peace. The book of promises, leaning over the vanity, discreetly blew a page. The air leaf found a short note written on a date that coincided with a distant spring. If there is restitution, the house will choose one memory to keep only one, and let the rest go. Fear, which had always demanded everything, stepped back before this unexpected generosity. Which memory would the mansion keep? Not the rites, not the vigils, not the minutes. Perhaps the garden without figures. Perhaps 2 hands that once touched whole. Perhaps the timbre of a laugh that dried before it learned to become weeping. He did not choose for it. He trusted. Light began to rise, not a definitive sun, but a noticed. The mirror's glass, touched obliquely, took on a pale gold gleam, and the fissure shone softly, not as a wound, but as a vein. The photographs, spread like maps of many lives, lost the feral shine of awakened silver and returned to the quiet of old objects. The bronze key upon the folded handkerchief seemed to relax its broken tooth. The locket, tired of centuries of tuning and complicity, cooled on the surface like a stone that at last finds the riverbed it belongs to. The in-between no longer stood at the door. The guardian, seated at the edge of the bed, contemplated the floor like someone learning to read again. The mansion breathed once more with its ancient lungs and then adopted the simple rhythm of a body asleep. The forbidden minute, with no brace, fainted. 317 became a number like any other. There remained, however, a secret that had to be crossed so love might be proof and not just idea. Before closing the book, displayed near the end a discreet note, perhaps written by Clara herself, perhaps by someone who loved her with the clarity once lacking. If restitution is fulfilled, follow the path of waters. The past does not end where the photograph began. It was a map without drawing, a compass without north, an indication that the truth the old photo had promised and hidden lay outside the house, among the cypresses where the earth keeps what light can't learn. The vestibule opened the front door with a sweet lament. The hill wore the damp of a world that gathers shadows before day. He descended the steps like one who neither arrives nor departs, only accompanies. The cypress garden, still in its architecture of mourning, awaited his approach without theatrics. Among the trees the pale light invited a gesture he did not know but his body recognized. Set the ring upon the ground, touch the locket to the cold stone, tilt the book until the wind turned its pages without a hand. The earth breathed beneath his touch. Then the house's final requirement made itself heard, not as command, but as gratitude. A rustle of leaves answered the restitution with a simple drawing in the dust, 2 curves that almost touch and need not. It was a sign, and with it rose a precise, entire, unframed memory in the middle of his chest, bearing the exact weight of a realization that love, without captivity, is memory too, but a living memory, which accepts an ending as one accepts a beginning. Satisfied, the hill delivered a calm certainty to the man. The climax, when it came, would not be noisy. It would be clean. It would be the meeting with what the photograph could not contain. It would be the answer to the question the old ink had written on the back. Please, don't believe everything you see. Seeing would not suffice. One had to return. And in returning, at last, truly see. The wind blew from the valley, carrying the mist away, opening the view of the town as if someone had drawn a curtain. He breathed deep. The ring became only metal, the locket only glass, the book only leather and pages. The mansion behind him did not demand a return. The spiral, unbound, shed its habit and gained a horizon. And on the soft earth, something began to emerge, not an object, not a face, but a trace the water had kept for decades. A silent invitation to the last crossing. The trace rose from the earth like the first bone of a body relearning its name. It wasn't large. It wasn't clear. It was an irregular paleness, like a stone worn by time's saliva. He knelt before the shape and smelled the hill's damper, mild mixture of leaves, soil, and iron that commonly accompanies what has been kept for a very long time. The cypress garden motionless, a silent chorus watched without intervening. The dawn light, still hesitant, seemed colder upon the object, as if the day respected the ancient temperature of things that wake. He brushed away the thin layer of dust with the backs of his fingers. The outline proved larger than it had first seemed. It was a frame without glass, blackened wood, tiny cuts along the edges, not ornaments, but marks of use. The inner side was lined with a nearly dissolved cloth, stained by damp and by the ghost of an image no longer there. The frame had the exact shape of those resting in the album hall, but this one was older, rougher, almost a prototype of the gesture the house had perfected in the basement. There was no silver, no technique. There was only intention. The intention to hold the world by its edge. His hand slid along the sides and felt in the grooves small scars of metal nails removed, replaced, removed again. The frame had been used and then stripped, a sheath without a body. Lifting it, he recognized its weight, the kin of the great portrait that showed the silver garden, the one that had moved the clock to 3:18 for the first time. The difference lived in the emptiness. Here in the wooden heart, absence was full, open, breathable. For an instant, the hills seemed to exhale the scent of clean laundry, as if unearthing the frame had aired some memory pinned beneath the grass. The water that remembers does not live only in the basement stones. It inhabits the world's surfaces too, trunks, leaves, roots, the shallow bottom of an old basin. Beside the cypresses, a stone basin he had never noticed gathered the morning's first rain. The liquid mirror hardly trembled. He leaned over and saw his own face, marked by the rings, scratch paler from vigil, steadier from decision. But there was something there that did not belong to now. A slow shadow slid across the reflection, as if a cloud were crossing without existing in the sky. It was the outline of pinned hair, bare nape, a woman's shoulder, the exact memory the house had shown so many times without granting whole. He lifted the frame and set it over the basin, aligning the vacant wood to the circle of water. The simple, act-aligned worlds, the liquid surface, framed, seemed to take on depth. The first breath of wind fell with delicacy and changed the pattern of tiny ripples. The reflection returned, not the man's face any longer, but the mansion's terrace seen from below, if the hill remembered its own gaze. There were quick steps, a light fabric held against thighs so it wouldn't drag the grass. The breathing of someone who doesn't wish to be heard. His heart beat to the rhythm of a scene that had not survived on paper. What the house had learned to imprison now revealed itself where the house did not rule. In water, the memory drew deeper back. The chapel appeared, small, its wooden door open inward, the shadow of a candle dancing with no audience, a blue ribbon pinned to a pew, forgotten from another festivity. And in the penumbra, two hands entwined, not in offering, not in formal promise, but in the sweet haste of a meeting that must stay hidden lest it be lost. On his hand, the ring already existed, without the diagonal scratch. On hers, the glow of a translucent stone seemed to burn from within. The water held the scene for a time that obeyed no clock. He understood the hill had kept the oldest memory, the one that never fit the basement's laboratory, the birth of the secret. The danger that had shadowed him since arriving at the mansion changed its nature. It was no longer the threat of a right demanding payment. It was the threat of what reveals itself whole. Neither the guardian, nor the in-between, nor the house could control the water that remembered. The exhumed frame welcomed the reflection like a garment returned to its owner before the shelf was rearranged. He drank in each detail with the restraint of a physician listening to a newborn's lungs, and then the image ran not because it vanished, but because it wished to reach its destination. The next scene brought, for the first time, Clara's face from the front, outside the plate's silver theater. There was no reposeful serenity, no sweetness of an antique painting. There was vitality. Her gaze, alive, sought not the camera nor the mirror, it sought the world. The water, trembling beneath the frame, gave sight to the landscape below the town, a narrow street, the murmur of a market, a white cloth hung in a window. Then a flash of shade, the mansion wall from inside, and the curve of her shoulder brushing the corridor. Memory did not recount, it showed. In that flow he finally saw the truth missing from diaries and books. Before the ritual, before the prison, before the laboratory altar, there had been a plan of escape, not a pact with the beyond, not an ambition of eternity, but a human-to-human plan to leave the house on the first breath of summer, when cicadas confuse the ear and no one misses footsteps in the grass. The ring would be left on the vanity as a false clue, the dress traded for one without lace, the spiral ignored. The photograph meant to seal presence would be replaced by an empty frame lightly tethered over the true portrait until the dawn of departure. The water, generous, had kept the copy of the copy, the frame itself, the very one his hands now raised. The plan failed at the final gesture. The water showed the guardian in his primitive version, not yet the disciplined basement shadow, but a young man afraid of losing too much. His eyes weren't cruel, they were helpless. He read the plan not as escape from the house, but as escape from him. And at the first minute the clock ever held its breath, he chose method over trust. His hand, quick, drew Clara back to the studio center. The ring's metal touched the glass. The lamp obeyed. The last breath was taken. Then the water became sea for an instant. The reflection lost shape and returned only broken light. He lifted the frame away with care, and saw that the stone lip of the basin bore an inscription dust had hidden for years. Hand-cut letters, irregular but firm, forming a phrase the house would never have allowed within. Forgive what fear has learned. The plea carved with the humility of things meant to last under sun and rain went through. Him like a bitter remedy that returns a fever to its proper measure. Love now was not memory, it was task. It wouldn't suffice to restore the mechanism to the common world. The breath had to be given back. No one returns breath with silver and glass. No one returns breath with pages and hours. Breath returns where it was taken, in life. He understood the climax would not happen inside the house. It would happen with the house, and despite it, in the space it had always envied, the open air. He laid the empty frame on the grass, like someone marking a place for a new ritual that has no liturgy. He took the ring off his finger and, for the first time since he'd received it as an inheritance, saw the pale groove the metal had left in his skin. The recent diagonal scratch gleamed like an honest scar. He set the ring inside the basin, letting the water receive it. Touched by the light, the metal sank a bit, and then stayed suspended as if deciding on which side of time it would choose to breathe. The overlocket, which had always served as a tuner, was placed beside it. The rough face turned toward the sky. The wind pushed the valley's mist farther down, and the town, as rooflines began to take shape. The man opened the book of promises and looked not for the pages of technique but for the marginal notes, the ones where the handwriting allowed itself some sweetness. A single line, lost among dates, shown exactly like an idea, arriving tired, and sure, if breath was taken by the image, let the image learn to breathe. The method yielded to an almost impossible inversion. Make the portrait inhale. The material world doesn't accept metaphors without a body to bear them. The man understood. He picked up the empty frame and held it before his face like someone rehearsing a self-portrait without a camera. He drew a deep breath not into himself, but into the rectangle. The gesture was ridiculous and grand. The hill, complicit, returned a breeze in a low countersong. He took 2 steps, set the frame back over the basin, aligned the ring beneath the surface, touched the locket to the stone rim. The book open, weighted the left corner like a hand steadying paper to sign. And then he did the only thing the house had never allowed. He blew into the water. It wasn't theatrical, it was brief, concentrated, as if a birth required discretion. The liquid surface vibrated in a pattern no silver nitrate could register. For a second, the frame seemed to pull light to itself. The ring moved on its own, slow, and then went still. The locket, inert, returned a glint without reflection. The water, satisfied, calmed. A greater silence settled among the cypresses, not an absence of sound, the presence of something that until then had had no place. He brought his hand to his chest and felt that his heart had learned a new rhythm. It didn't count minutes, it counted openings. The danger hadn't ended every crossing exacts a price, but now, the danger was losing himself in the dazzle of his own feet, of turning the act of restitution into yet another rite. He stepped back from himself, keeping the humility of first discoveries. When he looked back at the basin, the water showed, for the last time, an image that wasn't a reflection. Clara, in the garden, dressed in common light, her eyes full of world, walked not toward the house, not toward him, but toward a point without a frame, among the trees. Her face had a serenity he had never seen in the plates. It was the serenity of someone reclaiming her own breath. The scene asked for no applause and no plea. It simply existed. And as what is alive exists, it passed. The mansion behind him understood. The vestibule, still open, let out a final draft that smelled of clean wood. The clock, overcome, accepted the morning. The mosaic off-center did not try to return. The guardian, inside, found an ordinary chair and sat with the just fatigue of one ending a shift with no return. The in-between withdrew to the nothing that had always been its lot, and the man before the basin realized there was still one gesture left for restitution to be complete, to return to the house what had sustained it for so long. He lifted the ring from the water. The metal was cold as truth, light as a promise kept. He slid it back onto his finger, not as a seal, but as a remembrance. He picked up the locket, and without anger, broke the glass against the basin's stone, letting the shards fall, bright, among the damp roots. Free to function, the object became only matter. The book of promises, resting on his knee, received the weight of his hand. He tore out the last page, the one never written, and let it drift into the water, where it dissolved, gentle like bread soaked through. The garden accepted it. A bird crossed high above with a short slash of wing. The man's body, exhausted, balanced itself on a rare peister kind that arrives without a speech. Even so, the story wasn't over. The greater secret, the one the old photograph had promised to change, rested not in the water, not in the frame, not in the pages, but beneath the earth where the rectangle had been found. Something else waited, something no device would summon, because it would answer no summons. It was the concrete matter of the past, not its image. He leaned the frame against the nearest cypress, opened the ground with his fingers, softened by damp, and the hill yielded like an undone seam. An object wrapped in heavy cloth rose to the surface. The fabric smelled of dried herbs and iron and was tied with a cord that the patience of years had turned slack. Untying it, the cloth revealed a small wooden coffer, varnished dark with a simple clasp. No trick. He opened it with the same restraint with which he had received the first photograph. Inside was a sealed, heavy paper envelope. On the seal struck into it, the doubled spiral knot as an emblem of obedience, but as a guarantee of arrival. On the back, a hand he recognized not by sight but by skin wrote a few words, enough to raise another dawn in his chest, for after the last breath, for when love is restitution. The sun, at last, touched the cypress tops, and the man's fingers, trembling like those that hold a newborn, broke the seal. The paper gave with a dry sigh, as if the cellulose itself had waited decades to loosen its throat. He lifted the envelope as contents with the care of someone handling a bird just saved from a window. There were 2 sheets and an object so thin it seemed pressed from light. The first sheet bore a firm line, the plan of the mansion not as a map of rituals now, but as confession. Arrows traced routes that skirted the studio and avoided the portrait wing, crossed the vestibule beneath the mosaic, and followed a tunnel not recorded in any notebook. In place of hours were the seasons. In place of the forbidden minute, one word repeated in small letters, dawn. The second sheet was briefer recipe without ornament. It listed 3 gestures: return the metal to water, break the glass, and open the ground by the cypresses. No blades, no lamps, no ammo. At the end, a sentence that seemed written by another handwriter, so light the ink nearly failed. What didn't fit the image fit the body. What fit the body must be returned to the earth. The house, for all its science, had never reached this paragraph. The hill had, between the sheets, pasted like regret, lay a translucent membrane not of silver, but of some old, organic material, perhaps treated intestine, perhaps a tiny parchment. Inscribed into it was the shape of 2 hands, joined, and in the background, the garden. Not a photograph, not a drawing, a mold. The absence of light in that object was complete, as if it had been made in shadow to keep a shadow. He felt he was touching the first residue of a gesture time had failed to dissolve. It was the pressure of the encounter, concave and convex, fitting everywhere and nowhere at once. His body answered before his mind. His skin bristled not from cold, but recognition. The mold was the record of the instant before the taking of the last breath, proof that love had once had a whole body before being converted into a rite. Danger, suddenly, shifted. It no longer lived in the house or the guardian. It lived in Himden, the temptation to turn that find into a new fetish, a new portable altar. The story allowed him no other prison. He tucked the mold back into the box, like returning to a nest what doesn't yet know how to fly. The tunnel on the first drawing started at a point by the outer wall, disguised by old roots. He circled the garden, his feet feeling the change from grass to bare soil, his breath tuning to the rhythm of leaves. The opening revealed itself as an earthy mouth, a low gap, irregular stone. The dawn's light did not enter there, only the smell of inside limestone and moss, with a distant note of old wax. The mansion above stayed quiet, as if honoring a convalescent's demand for silence to cure a fever. The tunnel was short but full of echo. Each step brought back a returned version of its own sound, as if the hill repeated it to confirm existence. His body brushed into dust, a thin layer that had gathered along the walls, and that dust, touched, released a slight sweetness, perhaps dried flowers someone had kept there, not as cult, but as a habit of care. At the end, a narrow room opened into natural penumbra. The smooth floor bore drag marks, as if boxes had been pulled and pushed for years. In the center, a rough bench held another box smaller than the one in the garden, but heavier, as if the material contained a density of decades. Inside were no photos. There were things: a ribbon, its color gone, a hair clip, a page from a notebook with a penciled sum, a scrap of cloth smelling of soap, a small bird bone, objects without aura, their near insolent banality set against so much grandiloquence of silver and glass. That poverty of miracles moved him. Here lived the past, lived, not the past displayed, an enchantment without theater, an inventory of small weights that love scatters through the world, as if marking a path for the way back. Under the cloth, a linen bundle held something of irregular shape. Opening it, his hand found a bottle stoppered with wax. The liquid inside was clear, and in the dim light seemed to offer no resistance to the eye. The label, nearly erased, carried the handwriting he knew from other notebooks. Forced to confess what the previous hand had refused to admit, breath kept. It wasn't tea, a literal trick. Clara S. Air wasn't tea reliquary there, but a desperate exercise to capture the scent of a night. S. breathing repeated so many times the bottle had absorbed something between memory and invention. Shame for the method returned as a pale heat in his face. The house, after all, had gone farther in its hunger than he had supposed. Fixing the face hadn't sufficed. It had tried to bottle the breath. Danger showed its teeth. To break the bottle would destroy a lie. To keep it would feed the right. Love required the first option. His hand hesitated with the prudence fragile things impose on the living. He twisted the wax stopper gently and felt the cap give with a tiny crack. An almost non-existent smell touched the air, not lavender, not flowers, not silver, but the temperature of a dark room that slept without fear. It wasn't Clara's breath, it was the breath of habit turned amphora. He lifted the bottle, tilted it to the earth, and returned the liquid, slowly letting the ground drink back the invention. The hill accepted it with a discretion that hurt more than any crash. The gesture had no glory, it had ethics. Beneath the bench, a loose board hid a shallow cavity. There, wrapped in heavy cloth, the last secret waited, a small hardcover notebook with no title, its pages sealed at the edges. Time had soldered the margin, not with malice, but with care. He opened it halfway and heard the fiber part like old silk. Inside weren't instructions for the right, nor the house's genealogy, nor the list of costs and results. It was the story, not of a mansion, but of two people, written with the urgent delicacy of those who fear losing the best part of themselves. The notebook told of the days before the plan to flee, the almost secret joy of recognizing a gesture in the other, the impatience of ordinary hours, the way the outside world always seemed almost enough. And then, on a page where the lines slanted downward as if the hand were too heavy, a confession. He was the one who feared first, not the guardian who would come to exist, but the man who preferred eternalizing to departure, who mistook generosity for control, who took the shortcut of technique to avoid the abyss of trust. He hadn't done it out of malice, he had done it out of panic. The text did not ask forgiveness. It asked that whoever arrived there understand. When love chooses fear, it builds perfect houses for forgetting, and calls that forgetting salvation. His whole body seemed to lean into a well and find, at the bottom, his own face. There was no absolution in the lines. There was the chance to stop the repetition. The choice he'd made in the garden when he blew into the water was now supported by a truth that couldn't fit photographs. To love Clara, he had to let her belong to the place she came from, manned above all to free himself from the future version of himself that kept the altar alive. He came out of the tunnel with the notebook against his chest, as if his heart needed a counterweight not to be left empty. The garden, washed in a less cold light, looked larger, as if things, freed from the act of keeping watch, had gained room. The cypresses kept a liturgy-less silence. The basin, clearer, returned only the sky. The empty frame, leaned on the trunk, seemed happy not to contain anything. The mansion raised its facade without theatrics. It was simply a house. There was still the last crossing, he knew it. The Book of Promises could not go back to the vanity as a background piece. The locket, already broken, had lost its voice. The photograph of tomorrow, now almost entirely white, had met its fate. What remained was to enter the house with the body finishing its choice of restitution. To pass through rooms without rites, climb the stair without minutes, open the forbidden corridor without a secret, and teach the walls the sound of steps that don't ask permission of clocks. Crossing the vestibule, he noticed the mosaic, though off-center, held a steady vibration underfoot, not the machine's hum, but the floor's when it bears the right weight. The tilted portraits followed his passage with a new, disinterested courtesy. The studio, sweet with clean dust, displayed the bellows camera like a museum piece, dignified, retired. In the album hall, the main row had receded a handspan, revealing at the back the shelf of empties, covers without content, waiting for freedom to learn its own grammar. He set the newly found notebook on the central table, between the negative of absence and the box of ordinary things. Together they looked like a dismantled altar. One final gesture was needed for the house to accept, for good, a life without right. It would not be violence or fire. It would be reading. Reading in a low voice, one that can't be heard from outside, done with eyes and breath. His body lowered, his spine accepted the bend, and he began to move through the notebook's lines, not as one seeking instructions, but as one recognizing. With each page turned, the mansion let go another tooth of its invisible gears. With each memory welcomed, the forbidden minute lost a nail. When he closed the book, the silence had a different weave. No longer the velvet weight of the laboratory, the linen of a sheet beaten in the sun. His heart, without foam, rode a regular sea. Love, tested, asked not for spectacle, it asked for steadiness. He picked up the frame, went down to the vestibule with simple steps, and opened the door with a hand that did not tremble. Then danger, knowing itself beaten in the house, attempted one last ambush. It knotted all memories into a brief vertigo, offering him as barter an impossible vision, the mansion lit again by rights. Clara standing at the top of the stairs, the disciplined clock, the obedient minute, the ring's blue gleam, the world ordered by the old mechanism. It was beautiful the way grave ornaments are beautiful, tempting like the return of a vice. His body asked him to stay. His heart, trained by recent renunciation, smiled within and said no, not in words, but with the gesture of continuing. The hill awaited the end. The sun cleared the last of the mist. The basin.com breathed a clear sky. The man saw under the grass a new swell in the earth, just beyond where he'd unearthed the frame. Water, capricious, always returns more than you ask. He knelt again, his fingers raw from digging one more time, his breathing steady like someone advancing by conviction and not urgency. The earth yielded with the docility of a thing that wants to be found. First appeared a scrap of cloth, then a corner of thick paper, protected by a layer of wax. He pulled carefully until he freed a large card, the size of the bigger portraits in the hall, packed to withstand humidity. It held the weight of a full century waiting for a pair of hands. Sealed, the card bore the spiral not as orders, but as farewell. At the edge, struck into it, a date that had not yet occurred when the house imprisoned memory, the same the false album had promised as tomorrow. His heart beat once, only once, like a door opening. His skin burned with the mild fever of those who touched the last riddle, and before the daylight could wash everything, he raised the card to the sun exactly as, inside, the mansion, now only a house, gathered the last sigh of its old music. He held the card to the light and, for an instant that seemed to suspend the world's noise, nothing happened. No gleam, no hurried epiphany, only the rough resistance of thick paper crossed by timid brightness. He kept his arm extended, like one testing the truth of a horizon. The sun, patient, advanced another step upon the hill, and then a very pale amber began to bloom across the surface, from corner to center, like the first veins showing beneath the skin of someone waking from fever. It wasn't silver, it was another chemistry. Lower earthier, as if light were writing directly into the material S-grain what the house had never let thrive. The image did not appear all at once, it insinuated itself. First, a floor of irregular flagstones, then the short shadow of a facade that wasn't the mansion's, but a narrow street's lines of laundry high above. the sky cut into a strip. A wooden door with simple ironwork emerged in the card's middle, and beside it, nearly touching the jamb, a woman in profile holding something to her chest. The man's heart made the old gesture of recognizing his own story in another body. Clara, at last, but not under the lab's perfect varnish. Clara with hair pinned imperfectly, with the breath of someone who had run, with skin that had met the sun and not the red lamp. Clara with a newborn. Truth pierced the day's calm with a tender violence. The great secret had never fit the house because it was too alive. After the night when fear chose technique, there was an afterward the spiral refused to admit. The escape, which had seemed aborted, was carried out in another fold of the world. The image showed what the album hall would never host. Clara far from the glass altar, Clara in the murmur of a street. Clara in the inaugural work of nursing her gaze set not on the past, but on the new outline of the future that weighed in her arms. The ring on her finger existed, its translucent stone burning with daylight. On the man's hand in the photograph, there was no ring at all. Because the man in the photograph wasn't the guardian, wasn't the rights contractor, wasn't tomorrow's trained version. He was someone outside the mechanism, a face not captured, partly out of frame. His body leaning toward mother and child, like someone arriving with bread and water. Warmed, the paper affirmed more details. A hand-painted sign on a beam named a neighborhood he knew by ear from old city stories, and a pencil date on the back later than the official date of the last breath. The world, in a quiet and sovereign gesture, had gone on without the house's permission. Here lay the change that split apart what he'd thought he knew. Clara lived. She lived outside. She lived with the steady courage of one who learns to call every day what, within binding walls, would be called miracle. A different danger, however, passed through him. The risk of turning that photograph into another altar, another fetish, another anchor. The lesson of restitution required one more step. It wasn't about keeping forever the image of Clara with the child. It was about accepting that this image had existed in its time, and that life, not the portrait, had been the place where the promise was fulfilled without an audience. He inhaled slowly and felt the thread that tied together his unrest since the first photo found at the market. The ring he wore wasn't the seal of a prison, but the legacy of a life that continued. The recognition, instead of supernatural, had blood. He hadn't been called by the house solely by memory's gravity. He'd been drawn by his own lineage. Picard confirmed what his body already intuited. In the lower corner, a small inscription in hand fought the light to remain, the baby's name, followed by the surname that, somewhere along the curve of time, would become the Traveler's. The link closed without noise. That boy grew, kept small objects, inherited a ring passed on broken stories, and generations later, an old photograph reached a market, waiting for the moment when a descendant mistaking destiny for research would be pulled back to the hill to free not the image but the crookedness. His body took a shock that didn't come from fear. It came from humility. The love that brought him there wasn't his alone. It carried the secret work of women who teach houses to unlearn, of children who grow up far from altars, of men who once confessed panic in a notebook and, without knowing, gave those ahead the chance to set things right. The Guardian, inside, sensed this like someone hearing his own story told without heroics for the first time. The mansion, behind the nape of the day, accepted that it wasn't a stage. It was a backdrop for an act that had ended long ago. Even so, the climax required a confrontation, not of bodies, not of voices, but of the house, even converted, still held its fibers tight. Somewhere a door bit its jamb. Elsewhere a portrait insisted on straightening. The forbidden minute, undone, still circled the edge of attention like a habit asking for one more sip. The card had to go to the only place where its beauty wouldn't turn into worship. The wall of empties. Not altar, not drawer, not coffer. The new space, reserved at the hall's back, for what the house has agreed not to domesticate. He came down from the hill with the card against his chest, holding back the urgency with which we carry children and farewells. Entering, he noticed the corridor's light wasn't the same. It didn't tremble to please. It carried dust over the surfaces and left it on the floor without drawing impressions. The vestibule received him unhurriedly, and the mosaic, relieved of its work as cardinal point, accepted the weight of his steps like a letter finally delivered. In the album hall, the old murmur of spines had ceased. The recessed row showed, as a promise kept, the raw wood gap where a single nail waited. He fit the card onto the support. No glass, no frame, no pin. The paper breathed. Its fibers yielded to the room's warmth, and the image darkened for a moment and then settled, like someone adjusting to a bed after a long trip. No competing plates, no observatory eyes, no hungry red lamp, The photograph was at peace. Before that rest, his heart understood the house would only finish learning when he finished his part. Choosing not to remain, love tested, also had to prove it could walk. The mansion, aware, prepared the last test. From the studio came the sound of glass recognizing its fate. The bellows camera, retired, creaked like an old man shifting for better sleep. On the table where so many plates once slept, silvered a single rectangle, blank this time, weighted, not sensitized paper. Common paper, no chemicals about, no red lamp lit. On the clean fiber, penciled with the frankness of notes left on refrigerators, an anonymous hand had drawn an arrow pointing outward. Beside it, the word that neutralizes enchantments, go. His body smiled within with the gravity of one who has finally heard the missing argument. The guardian, leaning on the bedroom threshold, stood like someone handing over the post-desk key and turning his eyes back to the lives of others. The in-between dissolved into the thickness of ordinary light, like dust finding where to settle. He picked up the paper not to keep it, but to obey it. Passing through the vestibule, the mosaic didn't creak. The clock asked for no numbers. The door opened with the courtesy of houses that have learned their place in the world. Outside, the hill breathed in the broad cadence of mornings that promise heat. The cypress garden kept its morning profile not as a reminder of loss, but as a memory of form. The basin returned only blue. The empty frame, propped to the trunk, looked like a portable window refusing to choose a view. He noticed that his hands, freed from ritual, looked for other work, calmly closing the notebook's box, gathering the ribbon without fetishizing it, sweeping wax crumbs with his forearm like someone clearing a table before serving bread. The last fear, the fear of leaving and seeing everything return as it was, showed itself as a shallow shadow, the kind that passes without settling. The house quiet affirmed it could no longer sing the old song complete. The forbidden minute might haunt corners for a few days, like refrains we whistle without meaning to, still the score would be missing. Love had changed its casing. It had ceased to be right to become path. Before descending the slope, he looked once more at the new photograph resting in the empty space. It was clear and human, without theatrics. Clara with the child and the world. It asked for no tears. It asked to be followed by footsteps. The ring on his finger weighed less, not as if it had lost meaning, but as if it had found the place on the body where it doesn't bruise. The diagonal scar was now a signature, not a wound. The act of touching the metal ceased to be a password. It became a wave goodbye. He took the first step toward the town. The hill accepted his stride without trying to catch him by the heels. The valley offered the murmur of life. His heart settled into a wide baton where tenderness and firmness combine without canceling each other. There was still work to do. Tell those who need to hear without display. Return to the everyday what had been usurped from it. Keep ordinary objects discreetly. Let the living raise their own images which don't need a laboratory to endure as long as they should. No topo da escadaria da mansão, pela última vez. O vidro do espelho que outrora servira de fronteira, recebeu delicado esboço de condensação. Não era rosto, nem uma mão entreaberta. Era uma curva simples, como sorriso que se entrega ao mundo, e não a artificialidade. A curva se desvaneceu sem esforço, como tudo que aprende a não se agarrar. The old photograph, the first one, yellowed, bought at the market, had promised change. It delivered beyond expectation. It didn't correct the past. It rehearsed another form of future. And as the man went down, the house, finally a house, gathered the remnants of the mechanism and carried them to the dust room, where things that have served rest with dignity. The hall of empties, now with its first inhabitant, seemed broader. The doubled spiral, engraved here and there, lost its hypnotic power and became just a drawing. At the lip of the hill, where gravel begins to become street, the wind roared from far off. The echo of children running, life frameless, practiced its own photography, light on things that happen before anyone thinks to keep them. The man's body answered with one more step, and another, and another. With each advance, the mansion grew smaller, not by disappearing, but by assuming its right size. Love, put into the world, no longer needed proof. In his pocket, the paper with the arrow insisted, without force. It pointed ahead, and behind his shoulder, in one last flare of morning, the hall of empties blinked with a brightness that felt like a blessing. The descent of the slope was not a theatrical farewell, but a continuous gesture, as simple as breathing. He felt beneath his soles the irregularity of stones, the fine dust sticking in the creases of his shoes, the discreet elasticity of grass where the hill leaned more. His body, tired without defeat, tucked memory away like someone placing clean linens into drawers that finally glide without sticking. The air carried the smell of bread someone was already baking. and the valley returned a murmur of people opening windows, sweeping steps, making coffee. There was an exactness to the light no red lamp could imitate, a clarity without ambition that accepted shadow as a necessary border. The mansion behind him now simply a house diminished in size and in demands. It no longer blew instructions, insinuated sacred minutes, or cracked floors to impose reverence. It breathed with the quiet pride of places that have fulfilled their task and learned not to repeat themselves. The window of the room where the mirror had long kept the frontier of the impossible reflected only the common sky. The fissure, once a map of promises, had become a line of accidental beauty. The vestibule with its off-center mosaic kept plumb on its own, as if trusting the wall's muscles. And in the Hall of Empties, the portrait of Clara with the child settled in peace, protected not by glass, but by the silent commitment not to become an altar again. He recognized in his own gait the modulation of what had been unlearned. His steps stopped seeking angles, stopped measuring reflections, stopped predicting the hour. Vigilance dissolved into attention, and attention, purified of fear, made room for the detail the house had never been able to bottle, life happening in spite of curatorship. A child ran down a distant street and stumbled. The echo of laughter after the stumble traveled to the hill and landed like a brief bird on the day's shoulder. A dog barked in a yard not to alert spirits, but to remind that morning has territories. A woman hung sheets, and their quivering whiteness traced, for an instant, the same gesture with which the empty frame accepted the landscape. Nothing asked for veneration, everything offered presence. He thought of the ring, not as a relic, but as a humble inheritance. The diagonal scratch now part of the metal, and not a wound, affirmed what the act of restitution had chosen. The scar as a signature of responsibility, a mark not to open forbidden doors, but to remember that doors exist, and that crossing them only makes sense when freedom lives on the other side. The blue stone, once the star of rights, returned to the role of a simple sparkle, a gentle reflection that began the afternoon when the light struck it at the right angle. No secret, no pact, only the smaller charm of objects that consent to be things. The city received him without astonishment. No one knew the hill beyond old habits of pointing it out to visitors. An improvised market was going up between two streets, stalls lining up colors and spices. The whole world revealed itself there on a smaller scale. The red of tomatoes, the dark green of leaves, the pale gold of loaves giving off steam, the unfantastic silver of knives knocking against boards. The old photograph that had set it all in motion, now kept among other mementos in his pack, weighed less than on the first day, not because it had lost importance, but because it had found its place among things, and not above them. The secret, in revealing itself, hadn't asked for pilgrimage. It had asked for a set table. He walked on hurriedly, attentive to how people return small promises to one another, the change handed back exactly, a fruit swapped for a sweeter one, the greeting that seals a simple agreement. In a few faces, he recognized features family albums often mistake for destiny, eyes that carried old weariness, smiles that persisted despite everything, brows furrowed not from malice but from tallying bills and cares. Lineage ceased to be a riddle and became work woven day by known and anonymous hands. There lay the other face of revelation, that the inheritance that matters is less blood than the disposition to restore. At noon he sat on a wooden bench where the sun arrived filtered by leaves. He set the pack by his feet and breathed. The house, invisible, no longer tightened cords in his chest. The hill, now just part of the geography, settled into the panorama like a good memory that doesn't insist. The photograph of Clara and the child, fixed in the Hall of Empties, was a light left on in a room one doesn't visit every day, but knows exists comfort enough when the cold asks for a story. He understood, with a tenderness that asked for no tears, that he would never have the Clara of the plates, and that this renunciation did not diminish love. On the contrary, it purified it of its ambition. To love is not to possess remembrance, it is to care for passage. He thought of the guardian. Perhaps he would live for a time yet in the leftover habits, like someone who turns out the lights by inertia before leaving a room. Perhaps, one day he would buy bread, sweep the porch, write simple letters without spirals to someone far away. Perhaps that body, trained to keep watch, would discover that vigilance, laid down, becomes ordinary care. The in-between, dissolved, would belong to the arithmetic of instants nobody photographs, and the mansion, relieved of its office as temple, would learn to grow old as houses do that have witnessed much, with a dignity fitting a crack, a worn banister, a door jamb that still creaks not to frighten, but to remind that a door remains. The afternoon advanced with gentle slowness. He rose and followed streets that asked for no hurry. He crossed an alley where a shop tuned clocks, the sound of their tiny patient mechanisms asked no obedience to a forbidden minute, but offered repairs so everyday time wouldn't lose its cadence. He passed a school where children drew the world with short pencils. On one table, a colored rectangle resembled an empty frame filled with sky. He entered a small church not seeking marvels, but to hear the fresh silence well-kept churches hold. Light fell in thin columns from above, and dust danced with the air. No altar competed with memories. Each pew received fatigue. When he returned to the inn, the simple room returned his measure. He placed 3 things on the table: the notebook found in the tunnel, the first yellowed market photograph, and a scrap of paper on which he wrote, in plain hand, the sentence he decided to keep from the Book of Promises. If there is restitution, the house will choose one memory to keep. Only one, and let the rest go. Below it, he added in his own hand, let the chosen memory be the one that breathed. He didn't sign, he didn't date. He folded the paper and tucked it inside the notebook, like returning a note to an old diary without demanding it be read. At night, the city lit common lights, windows haloed by clear bulbs, kitchens panting, glasses tapping once, laughter cutting through alleys and stopping when sleep called. He realized, grateful, that the hardest ghosts to appease are those that demand spectacle. The others, the ghosts of longing and care, learned to sleep to low music. Before closing his eyes, he thought of the opening questions, the ones that had once risen like locked doors. What if memories are paintings and not mirrors? What if love is the lodging of forgetting? What if the past is what breathes in us, asking return? Now the answer came not as theory, but as gestures. Blow on the water, break the glass, read life, choose the road. He slept with a heavy body and a light spirit. He dreamed not of corridors or portraits, but of a backyard where sheets played at being clouds. In the dream, the empty frame leaning on the cypress reappeared, and, on the far side, there was no image, only wind. He woke without haste, like those who have no sacred hour to keep. His hands reached for the ring by habit. The metal, complicit, answered with the temperature of objects that already belonged to the world. Days followed, not as chapters, but as pages that accept margins. He returned once to the hill, not to keep watch, but to check if the gate closed without effort, if the roof tiles would hold out in the rain, if the vestibule floor would bear the footfalls of those who might visit. In the Hall of Empties, the photograph of Clara with the child was unchanged. No fissure, no invasion of mold. The house, diligent, kept its part of the pact, to keep only one memory. Beside it, an entire wall remained bare, like invitation and discipline. It wasn't a matter of filling, it was a matter of respect. Outside, the cypress garden had changed its smell. The scent of lavender seeded to a nearly invisible vegetal perfume, damp earth and new leaves. The stone basin still gathered rainwater. Sometimes it reflected birds, sometimes the face of someone passing who didn't recognize themselves, sometimes nothing. The empty frame, leaning on the trunk, accepted being wood without a function, surviving the desire to capture. The hill, satisfied, boasted no secrets. Punctual, the light visited the house every morning and, at noon, withdrew slowly like guests who know when to leave. The man, for his part, learned to walk without watching himself. On moonless nights, when remembrance asked for a louder voice, he opened the tunnel notebook and read 2 or 3 pages, just enough to confirm that panic had been confessed and thus overcome. On sunny days, he let the ring glint a little in his hand, not as talisman, but as delicacy. And whenever life tempted him to fix an instant too tightly, a long embrace, a happy afternoon, a beloved face, he remembered the water and its discreet breath. He preferred to breathe. With time, the initial questions lost their roughness. They remained necessary, but became hospitable. And if memories are paintings, let them be, as long as they aren't mistaken for the whole canvas. And if love is the lodging of forgetting, let it be, as long as forgetting is rest and not prison. And if the past breathes in us, let it breathe, as long as it learns, like us, to open windows. The old photograph, the one that changed everything he thought he knew, was no longer a sentence, but a bridge. It had brought him to the threshold where pain and tenderness become indistinguishable, from which one sees the house as it is, and the world as it asks to be. And, standing on that threshold, the man chose what light does not demand but gladly receives: life, without frame, without ritual, with enough memory to guide, and enough forgetting to go on. The last time he turned toward the hill only to learn the movement of parting, he noticed a gentle glow in the Hall of Empties, as if blinking with the kindness of recognizing someone who departs. There was no promise there, no threat, only the kind of blessing well-kept things bestow when we no longer depend on them. He waved without lifting his hand, with his whole body the way wave those who understand that gratitude needs no witnesses, and, following the simple trail of light laid along the street, he entered the city that did not expect miracles, only presences. Love, without an altar, found a table. Death, without rite, received a name and a date. Like all human things, the promise, returned, chose to dwell in the act of mourning, and destiny, at last, discovered itself another word for care. If someone one day asks what was in that house, let it be said without hurry. There was a photograph that learned to breathe. There was one memory chosen among many. There was an empty frame that taught a hill to wind. There was a man who gave the breath back. And if someone, one day, asks what remained, let it be answered with the simplicity truth grants to ripened things. The world remained, as it is, and love, as it should be.